Hey guys, for something so often imagined as hearty and abundant, medieval meat was, for most people, a far stranger and far less comfortable part of life than the modern imagination tends to allow. What looked, from a distance, like a world of roasting spits, hunting feasts, and overflowing tables was also a world of scarcity, preservation, religious restriction, hard labor, and very uneven access to animal food. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like me to cover next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like on the video really does help support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, intelligent journeys into the past, subscribing is the simplest way to keep finding them. Now, to understand what eating meat was really like in medieval times, we have to begin by setting aside the feast table, because for most people, most of the time, that was not where life was lived. One of the easiest mistakes to make with medieval food is to picture the age through its ceremonies rather than its routines. The grand banquet survived in chronicles, romances, and illustrations because it was memorable, symbolic, and worth writing down. Daily meals for ordinary people were much less likely to enter the record in such vivid form. That imbalance quietly distorts the subject from the very beginning. If we want to understand not simply what people ate, but why they ate it, how often they could afford it, what it tasted like, and what it meant to them, then we have to look not only at aristocratic display, but at climate, land use, religion, animal management, storage, class, and the exhausting arithmetic of survival. In other words, meat in the medieval world was not just food. It was labor converted into calories. It was land turned into status. It was sometimes nourishment, sometimes privilege, sometimes obligation, and sometimes disappointment. A single piece of salted pork or stringy boiled mutton could tell you a great deal about the household that served it, the season of the year, the condition of the harvest, the church calendar, and the fragile local economy on which everything depended. For a modern viewer, especially in societies where refrigerated meat is sold year-round in carefully lit shops, the first useful adjustment is this. Medieval people did not experience meat as a steady, standardized category. They encountered it irregularly, seasonally, and in forms shaped by necessity. The animal itself mattered, of course, but so did age, sex, health, the purpose for which it had been raised, the time of year it was slaughtered, and the method by which the flesh had been preserved or prepared. Even the difference between fresh meat and preserved meat was not a small culinary detail. It could be the difference between pleasure and endurance. That is why the glamorous image of medieval meat begins to soften the moment we ask a practical question. Which medieval people are we talking about? A king in a hunting lodge, a monastery with fish ponds and managed estates, a town butcher serving prosperous customers, a peasant family with a pig, or a landless laborer surviving on pottage with only occasional scraps of animal fat. These were not minor variations inside the same food culture. They were profoundly different dietary worlds that existed side by side. For the wealthy, meat could be frequent, impressive, and symbolically important. Lordly households consumed beef, mutton, pork, venison where permitted, poultry, and a range of smaller game and birds. But even here, the story becomes more complicated when we slow it down. Meat at an elite table was not merely about appetite. It was arranged according to hierarchy. Certain cuts, certain animals, and certain methods of serving reflected rank. Access to hunted meat especially carried social meaning, since hunting rights were often restricted and bound up with lordship, law, and prestige. A venison dish was not just venison. It was a visible sign that someone belonged to a world where land, privilege, and violence against game were legally structured in their favor. Yet even the rich did not simply float above material limits. Fresh meat could spoil quickly. Winter slaughter mattered. Salting mattered. Smokehouses mattered. Transport mattered. A noble household might enjoy far more meat than a peasant cottage, but abundance did not erase inconvenience. It simply changed its scale. Great households had to provision large numbers of retainers and servants. They required stores, planning, preservation, and procurement networks. A feast might appear effortless when finally carried into a hall, but behind it lay a chain of killing, cutting, carrying, curing, accounting, and fuel consumption that was anything but effortless. For ordinary rural people, meanwhile, the relationship with meat was shaped by a very different reality. Most medieval peasants did not raise animals primarily in order to enjoy regular fresh meat meals. Animals had multiple uses, and in many cases their most valuable contribution came while they were still alive. Cows gave milk and produced calves. Oxen pulled plows. Sheep yielded wool. Hens laid eggs. Even pigs, which were often more directly associated with meat, had to be fed, managed, and timed carefully. To kill an animal too soon might mean sacrificing a long-term household resource for a short-lived meal. This is one of the least romantic but most important truths about pre-modern food. Hunger can make a household eat an asset, but stability depends on not doing so too lightly. A cow was not only future beef. It was traction, manure, dairy, reproduction, and insurance. A sheep was not only mutton. It was wool, lambs, and value on the hoof. In that sense, meat was often delayed by prudence. The animal's death had to make economic sense, not just culinary sense. So when common people did eat meat, it might come less often than modern assumptions suggest, and not always in the best form. Pork was especially important in many parts of medieval Europe because pigs could be relatively efficient to keep under the right conditions, particularly where woodland pasturing or household scraps helped support them. A village pig could convert otherwise less useful food into fat and flesh, and pork preserved reasonably well through salting or smoking. That made it practical. But practical did not necessarily mean luxurious. A great deal of meat eaten by ordinary people may have been tough, heavily salted, boiled into other foods, or used sparingly to flavor larger dishes built around grains and vegetables. That last detail matters. Meat did not always arrive as a dramatic centerpiece. Very often it entered the diet as an ingredient, a seasoning, a memory of richness inside a more modest meal. Animal fat, bones, offal, bacon pieces, or preserved fragments could transform pottage, soup, or stew without providing the sort of generous portions that later imagination likes to place on every medieval board. The smell of meat simmering may sometimes have promised more than the actual bowl delivered. And then there was the calendar. Medieval Christianity did not simply shape belief. It shaped appetite. The Church imposed numerous fasting days and dietary restrictions throughout the year, especially in Latin Christendom. The exact practice varied by time and place, and not everyone observed the rules with equal discipline, but the broad effect was significant. On many days, meat from four-footed animals was forbidden, while fish often remained permitted. This created a rhythm in which abstaining from meat was not unusual or exceptional. It was built into social and religious life. From a modern point of view, that can seem like a purely spiritual matter, but it had practical consequences that rippled through agriculture and trade. Fish demand rose. Preserved fish circulated widely. Households adapted menus and expectations. And perhaps most revealingly, people became skilled at distinguishing between forms of animal food in morally and legally meaningful ways. The medieval table was not governed only by taste or affordability. It was also governed by categories that connected the body to religious discipline. There is something quietly revealing in that. To eat meat whenever one wanted would not have seemed, in many contexts, like freedom in the modern sense. It could also suggest a failure of self-command or religious obedience. Medieval food culture was deeply entangled with ideas of restraint, sin, rank, and bodily management. So even in places where meat was desired, it was not always culturally framed as something to be consumed casually and without thought. And desire is important here because people did desire it. Meat carried prestige, satisfaction, and strength in the imagination of the period. It was associated with hospitality, martial vigor, and prosperity. For laborers and the poor, a chance to eat more meat could be genuinely welcome. For elites, generous meat service displayed magnificence. For the sick, certain broths or preparations might be judged restorative. But desire was constantly negotiating with reality. Animals took resources to raise. Land was finite. Seasons were unforgiving. Fodder could run short. Disease could ruin herds. A harsh winter could alter the contents of the pot long before anyone chose the menu. This is where the medieval pig-killing season becomes especially revealing. In many regions, late autumn was an important time for slaughtering pigs, partly because winter feeding was difficult and partly because cooler conditions helped with preservation. What followed was not a single glorious meal, but an organized household process. Meat would be cut, salted, smoked, rendered, stored, and allocated. Blood might be used. Fat would matter enormously. Intestines, organs, and less esteemed portions would not simply be discarded. In a world where calories were precious and waste dangerous, the whole animal had value. That is another point where modern assumptions often falter. When people imagine medieval meat, they tend to imagine choice cuts. Medieval households were much more familiar with total animal use. Organs, heads, feet, marrow, suet, skin, and blood all belonged to the economy of eating. This did not always mean cheerful enthusiasm. Some of these foods were strongly associated with necessity. But necessity can also generate skill. Recipes, local traditions, and inherited kitchen knowledge grew precisely because households had to make use of what they possessed. Even the texture of meat could be different from what modern diners expect. Many animals were older by the time they were slaughtered, especially when they had first served other functions. That could mean tougher flesh. Breeding was different. Feeding was different. Butchery was different. Cooking methods were shaped accordingly. Long simmering, stewing, chopping, pounding, spicing, and sauce-making were not merely matters of taste or refinement. They were often responses to the physical realities of the ingredients. And spices, though often over-discussed in popular history, do tell us something when handled carefully. The old myth that medieval cooks used spices mainly to hide rotten meat is too simple and largely misleading. People generally knew bad meat was dangerous and unpleasant. Spices in elite cooking were more often markers of status, fashion, medical thinking, and preferred flavor combinations. But the existence of that myth does reveal a deeper intuition modern people have about the medieval kitchen, that preserving freshness was hard, and that the gap between ideal food and actual food could be wide. That intuition at least points in the right direction. Because for many people, meat was not routine luxury, but occasional intensity. A holiday, a slaughter day, a lord's feast glimpsed from below, a ration, a memory of flavor carried in broth, a piece of bacon kept for long use, a bowl made richer by bones. And sometimes, especially in bad times, not even that. Famine, war, taxation, and displacement could reduce diets quickly and brutally. In those moments, the question was no longer what kind of meat people preferred, but whether any animal resource remained to be eaten at all, or whether keeping the last breeding animal alive mattered more than the hunger of the present evening. So the real story of medieval meat begins not with excess, but with constraint. It belongs to the management of scarcity just as much as to display. It belonged to the barn, the forest, the butcher's block, the smokehouse, the monastery rulebook, the market stall, and the peasant pot. And once we see that clearly, another question starts to emerge. If meat was so valued, so unevenly distributed, and so deeply tied to status and survival, then what did it actually taste like in everyday life, not in fantasy, but in the mouths of the people who had to live with its limits? That answer begins in the village, in the manor, and in the uneasy distance between hunger and privilege. That answer begins in the village, in the manor, and in the uneasy distance between hunger and privilege. If we stay close to the everyday table for a little longer, the first thing to notice is that taste itself was not experienced in isolation. Medieval people did not meet meat as modern diners often do, as a neatly separated portion with a fixed expectation of tenderness, cleanliness, and consistency. They met it mixed with smoke, salt, broth, bread, herbs, onions, ale, garlic, sourness, soot from the hearth, and the physical tiredness of the day that had led up to the meal. What meat tasted like was inseparable from how it had been obtained, how long it had been kept, and who had the right to enjoy the better part of it. For an ordinary household, fresh meat could be vivid precisely because it was not constant. A slaughter day would have had its own atmosphere, practical but also charged. There was work to do quickly, because freshness did not wait. Blood had to be caught and used. Fat had to be rendered. Pieces intended for immediate eating were distinguished from those meant for curing. The house, yard, or village space around the killing would have filled with smells much sharper and more intimate than the modern shopper ever encounters. Warm animal flesh, wet straw, smoke, steam, iron, dung, boiling water, singed hair, and salt all belonged to the reality behind the meal. The eventual stew or roast was only the final, calmer stage of a much more physical event. And because that event was so physical, medieval people were often less insulated from the animal origin of meat than most people are now. This did not automatically make them more sentimental or more cruel. It simply meant that the connection between living creature and edible flesh was more visible, more ordinary, and harder to ignore. A household might have raised the pig it later consumed. Children would have known the animal before they knew the taste of its winter bacon. A chicken might be alive one day and in the pot the next. That closeness could produce familiarity, indifference, gratitude, or reluctance, depending on the person and the circumstance. But whatever the feeling, it usually took place within a world that had far less room for abstraction. The texture of the meat itself could vary enormously. Young animals, when available, offered more tender flesh, but households and estates often had economic reasons not to slaughter them too early. A laying hen was more useful alive than dead until age or season changed the equation. A dairy cow might be kept for years. A draft animal had value in work long before it had value in the pot. This meant that much meat entered the kitchen from animals that had lived full working lives, and that is not a trivial point. Flesh from older animals can be stringier, denser, and more stubborn. It asks more from the cook and more patience from the eater. It does not dissolve into softness without effort. That helps explain why boiling and stewing mattered so much. In the modern imagination, roasting often stands in for medieval cookery because it is visually dramatic. A roast on a spit looks like history as people expect to see it. And certainly roasting was important, especially in elite settings where kitchens had the labor, equipment, and fuel to manage it at scale. But for many people, simmering meat slowly with whatever else was available made far more sense. A pot suspended over the fire could soften difficult cuts, stretch flavors into liquid, and feed more mouths than a single roast portioned cleanly at table. Broth, in that sense, was not merely a side product. It was part of the nourishment, part of the economy of the meal, and part of the memory of the meat. This is one of those small domestic details that opens into a larger system. If a household had only a modest amount of bacon, salt pork, or mutton, it could still make that quantity matter by letting the flavor move through peas, beans, leeks, cabbage, onions, or grain. The result was not an illusion of meat, exactly, but something more complicated. It was a way of distributing animal richness through an otherwise restrained diet. And because so much of everyday medieval eating depended on such mixtures, The sensation of eating meat was often shared across the bowl rather than concentrated in a single bite. Even among those who had more frequent access to animal food, preferences were shaped by social ideas that modern viewers do not always expect. Different meats carried different associations. Pork could be beloved, practical, and familiar, but it also sat differently in the cultural imagination than venison or beef. Mutton and lamb had their own place, as did capons, geese, and game birds at higher levels of society. Some foods signaled rusticity, some comfort, some wealth, some seasonality. Certain dishes might be admired not only because they tasted good, but because they displayed control over resources, household skill, or access to distant trade. This matters especially when we think about elite dining, because aristocratic meat eating was never just about consuming more. It was about consuming in a manner visible to others. A noble table did not merely provide calories. A staged order, seating arrangements, serving rituals, carving, sequence, and display all translated power into food. The lord or lady did not simply receive a better meal in secret. Rank was performed publicly through the meal itself. Choice pieces went to the appropriate people. Favored guests were honored through what they were given. Service became a language of hierarchy. And within that language, meat was unusually expressive. Large joints, whole birds, hunted animals, and elaborately prepared dishes could demonstrate command over land, labor, and time. To serve many kinds of meat at once was to prove that one had enough resources to overcome ordinary limitations. The table could momentarily deny season, distance, and difficulty. Yet the denial was never complete. Behind every show of effortless plenty was a great deal of effort, and the noble household was often less a place of spontaneous indulgence than a machine for turning estate income into visible magnificence. Kitchen records and household accounts where they survive can be quite revealing on this point. They show not simply appetite, but organization. Animals were purchased, received from estates, or rendered as dues. Fish and meat both had to be tracked in accordance with fasting rules. Cooks, butchers, carters, clerks, and servants each played roles in moving food from field and fold to table. This kind of evidence is sometimes less romantic than chronicles of feasts, but it is often more truthful. It reminds us that medieval meat consumption was embedded in bureaucracy long before the modern age imagined bureaucracy as one of its own inventions. And then there is the question of quality, which is not always the same as rarity. A wealthy household might have more meat, but that did not mean every bite was wonderful by modern standards. Preservation was still a challenge. Salting could harden and intensify. Smoking could help but could not transform everything into delicacy. Transport over distance could compromise freshness. Even the best kitchens operated within a world of fluctuating supply. A great household had solutions that poor households lacked, but it did not possess modern certainty. There were better and worse seasons, better and worse deliveries, better and worse animals. Medieval abundance still lived under the shadow of spoilage. This is where the modern fantasy of endless medieval feasting begins to look especially thin. Feast culture was real, but so was monotony. A household that slaughtered many animals in season and preserved the results might have security, but it might also spend long periods eating forms of meat that were repetitive, salty, or heavily worked into sauces and pottages. Luxury and boredom were not opposites. A table can be privileged and still predictable. In fact, one of the quieter truths about historical food is that repetition was normal across the social scale, though the wealthy repeated richer things. Religious fasting complicates the picture again in useful ways. It is tempting to treat fasting days simply as absences from the real story, as interruptions in meat consumption. In reality, they were part of how the food system worked. If many days prohibited flesh meat, then kitchens had to build habits, expectations, and supply lines around that fact. Fish became central, from local river catch to salted or dried imports that could travel great distances. Dairy, eggs, and substitutes were negotiated differently according to local rules and periods. Cooks developed parallel repertoires. So medieval people did not merely long for meat and occasionally lose it. They lived in a disciplined alternation between permitted and forbidden foods. That alternation did something subtle to the meaning of meat. It heightened contrast. It could make a return to flesh more noticeable, more desired, and more socially marked. A festival meal after restriction does not feel like an ordinary meal. It carries relief, rhythm, and a sense of restored permission. In that way, the church calendar did not only restrain appetite. It helped structure anticipation. Medieval food culture, then, was not flat. It moved through cycles of denial and access, and those cycles shaped memory. At the same time, rules were rarely as tidy in lived reality as they appear in official statements. Wealth could purchase flexibility. Some people obtained dispensations. Some communities observed more strictly than others. The sick, travelers, the elderly, and certain occupations might be treated differently. There were also endless local accommodations, quiet evasions, and interpretive habits that blur any simple line between strict observance and total disregard. This is another place where trust in the subject matters. The medieval world was disciplined, but it was not mechanically uniform. People negotiated rules because life required negotiation. Urban life added another layer. In towns, meat could be bought rather than primarily raised by the eater, and that changed the experience profoundly. The medieval butcher was a visible and often tightly regulated figure. Urban authorities cared about where slaughter happened, how waste was managed, what could be sold, and sometimes the quality or fairness of the trade. That concern was not purely humanitarian. It reflected smell, public order, disease anxiety, and the importance of provisioning a town without allowing the market to become dangerously corrupt or chaotic. A town customer, if prosperous enough, might encounter more regular access to fresh meat than some villagers, particularly if markets were well supplied. But this apparent convenience also depended on broader systems of transport and rural production. Towns consumed what countrysides produced. Drovers moved animals. Regional trade linked places together. Shortages in one zone could affect another. Weather, warfare, taxation, and disease among livestock all traveled through the market in one form or another. The city butcher's block was therefore not the end of the story. It was the visible point where much larger rural pressures became edible. Urban consumers also lived closer to the regulations and suspicions surrounding meat quality. Was the animal healthy before slaughter? Had the meat been held too long? Were butchers mixing standards, cheating weights, or selling what ought not to be sold? These concerns recur across many pre-modern cities because they were real enough to matter. People understood that meat could nourish, but they also knew it could disgust or sicken. Trust, then, did not only belong to the historian explaining the past. It belonged to the medieval buyer approaching the stall. And here the subject becomes more intimate again, because what counted as desirable meat was partly shaped by medicine as well as by pleasure. Medieval learned medicine, drawing on inherited traditions of humoral theory, did not regard all meats as identical. Some were thought easier to digest, more suitable for certain constitutions, ages, or conditions, while others were heavier, coarser, or more likely to disturb the body's balance. The exact advice varied across authors and settings, and practice on the ground did not always obey theory. Still, the point is important. Meat was not just taste and status. It was also something to be interpreted through ideas of health. That could influence elite menus, convalescent diets, and the advice given to those who could afford selectivity. Young poultry, certain broths, and carefully managed preparations might be considered better for the sick than robust salted meats or coarse flesh from older animals. Once again, the medieval world proves less simple than its caricature. It was not merely a rough place where people swallowed whatever they could seize. It was also a place where educated and inherited systems of food knowledge attempted, however imperfectly, to classify and guide what entered the body. Of course, advice is one thing and hunger another. In years of dearth, theory could thin out quickly. Poor harvests raised grain prices, and because grain stood at the foundation of most diets, that had consequences far beyond bread. When grain became scarce or costly, people were squeezed from every direction. Animal feed suffered. Households sold livestock. Future meat supplies weakened. Those who might once have stretched meals with fat or scraps had less to stretch. And because the poor were already living close to the margin, even a modest change in access could have harsh effects. War worsened everything. Armies moved through the countryside demanding provisions, stealing animals, trampling fields, disrupting markets, and creating fear that made normal agricultural timing harder to sustain. In such conditions, meat could become both more precious and more elusive. A family with a pig might try to hide it. A village might lose poultry, sheep, or cattle to passing forces. Taxation in coin could force sales that thinned household reserves. Long before a battle appears in a chronicle as a political event, it may already have entered village life as a loss of bacon, milk, eggs, and breeding stock. And that brings us toward one of the most telling contradictions in the whole subject. Medieval meat could symbolize strength, prosperity, and noble freedom. Yet the very animals that produced it were often too economically important to be eaten casually. The more precarious life became, the less sensible immediate slaughter could seem. In hard times, the fantasy of meat might grow even as its practical availability shrank. Want sharpened prestige. Prestige sharpened resentment. And resentment, in turn, sharpened social awareness, because everyone could see that the same society which preached order did not distribute comfort evenly. It is in that tension that hunting begins to take on its full meaning. For the aristocracy, hunting was recreation, training, ceremony, and a demonstration of rank. For the rural poor living near forests, parks, and lordly preserves, game could represent something else entirely. Food one could see but often not lawfully touch. Deer, boar, hare, and birds moved through landscapes shared in one sense but not in another. The legal right to kill them was itself a statement about who the land truly served. And once meat becomes a legal privilege as much as a nutritional resource, the story deepens again, because now appetite is tied not just to hunger, but to power. And once meat becomes a legal privilege as much as a nutritional resource, the story deepens again, because now appetite is tied not just to hunger, but to power. A rabbit in a snare, a deer in a forest, or a boar moving through a lord's woodland was never simply an animal in the medieval imagination. It could also be a moving boundary line, a reminder that nature itself had been folded into hierarchy. To kill certain creatures without permission was not treated as a trivial act of supper-making. Could be construed as theft, poaching, defiance, even an assault on the social order that hunting rights were meant to express. That can seem severe from a modern distance, until we remember what those animals represented. Forest law in parts of medieval Europe, especially in England after the Norman conquest, made clear that elite access to game was part of elite identity. The right to hunt was bound up with landholding, sovereignty, and domination over space. This meant that venison, in particular, acquired an aura out of proportion to its nutritional role. It was desirable not only because it was meat, but because it was restricted meat. A venison feast announced more than culinary success. It announced lawful command. For ordinary people, that created a bitter sort of visibility. They might live near woods where deer moved in plain sight, yet to take one was dangerous. In years of hardship, the temptation could be obvious. A single animal might feed a household generously by peasant standards. But the penalties could be harsh, and the moral framing was revealing. Medieval authorities often treated poaching not merely as hungry necessity, but as disorder. It threatened the visible distinction between those who possessed rights and those who lived under them. A lord's deer was, in effect, part of the architecture of rank. This is one of the reasons the medieval table can never be understood as only a matter of ingredients. Meat was embedded in a legal world. Woodland use, pasture rights, pannage for pigs, common access, tolls, market control, and seigneurial privilege all shaped what eventually appeared in a pot or on a platter. Even the most ordinary bowl of stew existed downstream from rules about land and animals. To ask what medieval people ate is therefore also to ask who could graze, who could gather acorns for swine, who could maintain herds, who controlled mills and ovens, who set dues, and who could turn landscape into private advantage. Pigs offer an especially interesting example here, because their relationship to the landscape was so practical. In many regions, pigs could forage in woodland on acorns, beech mast, and other food sources that did not directly compete with human grain to the same extent as some other forms of livestock raising. That made them useful to peasant households where rights of access still allowed such practices. A pig could be the difference between a year with some fat and a year without it. But because pigs depended so much on local ecological and legal arrangements, their value also reminds us that medieval food was never abstract. It was intensely local. A household's meat supply depended on what kind of land surrounded it, what rights it held there, and whether those rights were stable. Regional variation, in fact, is one of the quiet forces behind this whole subject. There was no single medieval meat experience. Climate, terrain, political structures, religious rules, and agricultural traditions differed enormously from one region to another. Beef might matter more in one place, mutton in another, pork in another. Coastal communities had easier access to marine food than inland ones. Mountain regions, forested zones, and fertile open-field landscapes generated different balances of animals and crops. Even within the same kingdom, one community's idea of a normal meat meal could differ sharply from another's. That is why any simple statement about the medieval diet tends to mislead. The Middle Ages were long and medieval Europe was wide. Still, some broad patterns hold. One of them is that animal protein often arrived through more channels than modern viewers first expect. Flesh meat is only part of the story. Dairy, eggs, drippings, lard, suet, marrow, and collagen-rich broths all mattered. A household that rarely served generous portions of roasted meat might still rely on animal products in ways that were nutritionally and emotionally significant. Butter or cheese could be precious. Lard could make coarse bread and vegetables feel more sustaining. The fat from one pig, carefully stored, might influence meals long after the fresh meat had disappeared. In this sense, to ask whether medieval people ate meat can sometimes be too narrow a question. Many lived with animal food in partial, dispersed, and indirect forms. That pattern also shaped memory and craving. Fat, especially, mattered enormously in a world of hard labor. Modern discussions of historical food sometimes focus so much on prestige meats that they miss a more basic physiological truth. For people doing heavy manual work in cold seasons with uncertain fuel and limited dietary variety, calories were not a minor concern. Animal fat represented warmth, satiety, and endurance. To us, a preserved slab of bacon might seem humble. To a laboring household in winter, it could be wealth in practical form. And yet, even here there was contradiction. The very foods that sustained the poor could be judged coarse by those with the means to prefer younger animals, finer birds, or more elaborate dishes. Class did not only separate people by quantity. It separated them by texture, by age of animal, by cut, by preparation, by seasoning, by the social meaning of what was served. A lord and a peasant might both technically eat pork, but they did not necessarily eat the same pig in the same way or under the same conditions. The difference between a carefully prepared dish in a noble hall and a salt-heavy pot in a smoky cottage was not merely one of taste. It was one of world. This becomes clearer if we linger for a moment in the kitchen itself. Medieval cooking spaces were often demanding places. Smoky, hot near the hearth, dim beyond it, physically tiring, and dependent on constant judgment rather than precise measurement. Recipes, where they survive, tend to come from literate and wealthier milieus, which means they give us more insight into elite kitchens than ordinary ones. They also often assume experience. They do not explain everything because the cook was expected to know. That silence can frustrate modern curiosity, but it also reveals how much knowledge lived in hands, habits, and repeated labor. In an aristocratic kitchen, meat preparation could involve impressive specialization. Carving, roasting, sauce-making, pastry work, and service all required skill, and the kitchen staff of great households might be large. Animals arrived, were broken down, assigned to different dishes, and transformed according to a cuisine that was often more complex than the popular image of endless roasting suggests. Sauces could be tart, sweet, spiced, thickened with bread or almonds, and shaped by humoral ideas as well as fashion. Color mattered. Contrast mattered. Presentation mattered. In that environment, meat became an ingredient in performance. But in humbler homes, where tools were fewer and fuel expensive, the logic of cooking was more directly tied to thrift. One pot might serve many purposes. The same fire had to warm the room, bake, boil, and preserve. A piece of salted meat might be soaked, boiled, reused, and stretched across several meals. Offal had to be cooked quickly. Blood might become sausage or pudding. Bones might be cracked for marrow or simmered to exhaustion. The household cook, often a woman working within relentless constraints, was not merely preparing food. She was managing risk. She was guarding scarce nourishment against waste, spoilage, and the appetite of too many mouths. That domestic labor is easy to miss in narratives dominated by kings and feasts, but it is central to what meat was really like. Most medieval people encountered meat through work before they encountered it through pleasure. Someone had to salt it, scrape it, hang it, stir it, trim it, watch the fire, judge the pot, and know which part should be eaten first because it would not last. Behind every preserved shoulder or kettle of broth lay accumulated practical intelligence. And because so much of that intelligence was ordinary, gendered, and rarely celebrated in high literary sources, it often disappears unless we deliberately look for it. There is also the matter of smell, which is hard to recover fully but too important to ignore. Medieval life was more odorous than modern sanitized environments, and food occupied that sensory world completely. Meat markets, slaughterhouses, kitchens, refuse pits, tanning, dung, smoke, and human proximity all overlapped in ways that made smell part of social knowledge. People knew by smell whether something was fresh, turning, salted, smoked, rich, or poor. A feast smelled different from a fast day. A town butcher's quarter smelled different from a monastery kitchen. A winter pig slaughter smelled different from a summer market. These were not atmospheric side notes. They were part of how food was judged and remembered. Taste itself, then, likely had sharper edges than we often imagine. Salt could be forceful. Souring agents like verjuice or vinegar might cut through richness. Herbs could be fresh when available, but often the plate was shaped more by preservation than by the bright produce modern diners take for granted year-round. Smoke was not a curated flavor profile. It was life around a hearth. Garlic, onions, mustard, ale, and animal fat all left their mark. A mouth used to this world did not seek the same kind of culinary purity often celebrated now. Mixed dishes, layered sauces, and textured broths made sense in part because medieval eating was not organized around isolating a pristine ingredient. It was organized around making ingredients useful, meaningful, and, where possible, satisfying. Sometimes the most revealing evidence comes from complaint. Satire, moral writing, urban regulation, and household concern all hint that people did not passively accept whatever meat came to hand. They noticed fraud. They disliked poor quality. They criticized greed. They worried about gluttony in the rich and lack in the poor. In monasteries and religious houses, debates could arise about whether certain diets had become too indulgent. In towns, suspicion of dishonest butchers could become a civic concern. In noble literature, extravagant feasts could be admired and quietly mocked at once. That tension matters because it shows that medieval people themselves understood that meat was morally charged. A monk's relationship to meat could be especially complicated. Many monastic rules restricted or limited flesh consumption, at least in principle, especially the meat of four-footed animals in ordinary circumstances. Yet actual practice varied, and over time some houses grew more relaxed or found ways around strict interpretation, particularly for the sick or for guests. The contrast between monastic ideals of discipline and the practical realities of institutional life tells us something broader about medieval society. Meat was one of the places where spiritual aspiration and bodily need met most visibly. To abstain could signal virtue. To indulge could signal weakness or privilege. To make exceptions required explanation. That same moral complexity appears in medical and elite culture, where different meats were sometimes ranked by refinement or digestibility. Delicate birds, kid, veal, and young animals might be favored in certain contexts, while beef could be seen as heavier, stronger, or more suitable for particular bodies and occupations. Such categories do not map neatly onto modern nutrition, but they mattered to people at the time because they connected food to temperament, age, and social life. A knight, a scholar, a convalescent, and a peasant laborer might not be thought best served by the same dish, even in theory. Yet theory could only govern so much. Once livestock disease entered the picture, all neat distinctions became vulnerable. Medieval herds and flocks were not secure from murrain and other devastating outbreaks. When animals sickened and died in large numbers, the consequences rippled outward. Prices changed. Breeding stock vanished. Milk supplies fell. Draft power suffered. Meat availability could collapse or become more erratic, depending on the scale and timing of the losses. The death of animals was not merely a butchering opportunity. Often it was an agricultural disaster. A dead ox was not welcome beef if what the village needed was a plow team for the next season. That is a particularly important corrective to modern assumptions, because it reminds us that more dead animals did not automatically mean more usable food. Disease could make flesh suspect, reduce future production, and destabilize local economies. A carcass was only an asset if it could be eaten safely, and if its loss did not damage the household more than the meal helped it. Medieval people were not ignorant of such trade-offs. They lived inside them. War, climate, and disease together created a food world that was always somewhat less stable than the imagery of static medieval life suggests. The Middle Ages were not a frozen painting. They were centuries of adaptation, local crisis, demographic expansion, contraction, and changing agricultural techniques. As populations rose in some periods, pressure on land increased. Marginal lands were brought into use. Forests shrank in places. Pasture patterns changed. Urban demand altered rural production. Over time, these shifts affected not only how much meat people could access, but what kinds of animals it made sense to keep. And this is where the manor becomes especially revealing. The manor was not simply a residence or a scenic estate. It was an economic structure, and its food arrangements often exposed the logic of medieval inequality in very concrete form. Peasants owed rents, labor services, or produce. Lords extracted value from land and people, then translated part of that value into consumption, display, hospitality, and military support. Meat moving into a manor kitchen was therefore not only a culinary fact. It could be the visible result of seigneurial power. The roast at the high table might be connected, however indirectly, to dues that thinned the stores of the families working the surrounding fields. That did not mean every manor table was permanently luxurious, nor that every peasant was permanently deprived. Reality was always more uneven than a simple moral diagram. Some peasants were relatively prosperous. Some lords were cash-strained. Regions differed. Seasons mattered. But the basic asymmetry remained. The ability to consume meat regularly, to choose among kinds of meat, or to reserve hunted flesh for one's household was bound up with the distribution of land and rights. Medieval meat was never just about appetite. It was one of the ways society made hierarchy edible. And because hierarchy could be seen and smelled at table, it could also become part of social memory. A great feast offered to tenants, retainers, or guests might be genuinely generous, but it also reminded everyone who had the power to host it. Hospitality softened domination even as it advertised it. To feed others well was a moral act, a political act, and a public statement. Could win loyalty, express piety, or soothe tension. But it only worked because ordinary life was not a feast. Abundance had meaning precisely because scarcity was familiar. So by the later medieval centuries, when towns had grown, trade networks had thickened, and written records had multiplied, the experience of meat had become even more layered. It was sold, taxed, regulated, moralized, prescribed, restricted, envied, displayed, salted, smoked, and argued over. It moved through monasteries and castles, cottages, and guild-controlled markets. It could nourish a worker, flatter a guest, test a conscience, or tempt a poacher. And as these worlds touched one another more frequently, another question begins to press forward. If meat carried so much weight in economy, religion, and status, what happened when medieval people tried not merely to eat it, but to turn it into ceremony on the grandest possible scale, where appetite, power, and spectacle all met in the same hall? What happened when medieval people tried not merely to eat it, but to turn it into ceremony on the grandest possible scale, where appetite, power, and spectacle all met in the same hall? The answer is that meat stopped being only nourishment and became theater, language, and political architecture. At the Great Feast, the question was no longer simply what was available to eat, but what could be made visible about the host's reach, legitimacy, refinement, and command over labor. A banquet was not an accidental collection of rich dishes. It was a carefully staged environment in which food, and especially animal food, helped transform wealth into something almost ceremonial. To understand this properly, it helps to imagine the hall before the first platter arrives. There is the arrangement of rank along the tables, the placement of the high seat, the expectation of sequence, the movement of servants, the controlled display of abundance before a room that already knows how to read status. In such a setting, meat could do several things at once. Could satisfy hunger, certainly, but it could also announce generosity, perform hierarchy, and bind guests into a temporary order under the host's authority. The more public the occasion, the less the meal was just a meal. Large roasted joints, game animals, elaborately dressed birds, pies filled with several creatures, and carefully carved servings all contributed to this effect. Yet one of the most revealing features of the Great Feast is that it often made food appear more natural and effortless than it really was. A swan or boar's head entering the hall looked like display. In truth, it represented transport, slaughter, butchery, fuel, kitchen labor, seasoning, timing, and the coordination of a household apparatus that might have been working for days. The beauty of a ceremonial dish depended on hidden work, and that hidden work was part of the point. A powerful household proved itself partly by making such difficulty look easy. There is a quiet irony in that. Medieval elites often used meat to symbolize dominance over the material world, yet the very need to symbolize that dominance revealed how hard the material world was to master. Refrigeration did not exist. Supply lines were uncertain. Religious restrictions interrupted the calendar. Animals were seasonal, vulnerable, and expensive to maintain. Fuel costs mattered. Skilled kitchen labor mattered. A feast of many meats was impressive because, beneath the glitter, everyone understood how many things had to go right for it to happen at all. This is also why the menu of a great feast should never be read too literally as a description of daily life, even for the wealthy. Ceremonial consumption tends to magnify what is exceptional. A coronation feast, a major wedding, a lordly Christmas, an episcopal household receiving distinguished guests. These were moments in which a family or institution wanted to be seen at its most commanding. The dishes chosen were often designed not merely to feed, but to astonish, flatter, and reassure. They told guests that the host belonged securely at the center of a social world ordered by privilege and display. Carving played a special role in this performance. The act of cutting meat at table, especially in elite contexts, was not a humble kitchen task transferred into the dining room. It could be a refined and semi-ceremonial skill. Manuals and courtly habits developed around the proper treatment of different animals, and while some of this was practical, much of it also signaled civility. To carve gracefully was to demonstrate control, education, and belonging. Even here, meat was not only eaten. It was interpreted, handled, and made to conform to codes of behavior. The codes themselves matter because they reveal a broader medieval truth. Appetite had to be disciplined if it was to appear noble. Gluttony was a moral danger in Christian thought and aristocratic culture, for all its love of abundance, could not openly celebrate pure greed without embarrassment. This produced an interesting tension. A host needed to be generous but not base. Guests were expected to appreciate richness, but not lose composure. The feast dramatized plenty while also surrounding consumption with etiquette, order, and the language of courtesy. In this way, the most extravagant meat service was often framed as civilized restraint governing abundance, not crude indulgence. Of course, reality must have varied. Some feasts were probably chaotic, overeager, or unpleasantly excessive. Some guests no doubt ate too much. Some kitchens failed to execute perfectly. Yet the ideal remained important. Medieval elites did not wish to think of themselves as merely devouring resources. They preferred to imagine themselves as hosting magnificently, ruling graciously, and expressing legitimate superiority through measured generosity. That ideal is worth noticing because it shows how deeply food belonged to moral performance as well as bodily pleasure. The theatricality could become quite elaborate. Dishes were sometimes shaped, dyed, ornamented, or reassembled for visual effect. Subtleties, those decorative and often edible constructions presented at important feasts, turned the table into a kind of symbolic stage. They might convey political messages, heraldic references, or imaginative scenes. Even if the details varied from one occasion to another, the broader pattern is clear. Medieval elite dining did not separate nourishment from spectacle nearly as sharply as modern observers sometimes do. To serve a creature in a recognizably magnificent form was to make a statement before a word had been spoken. And yet, the more ornamental the feast became, the more it depended on a body of practical knowledge that was anything but ornamental. Great kitchens needed structure. Meat had to be acquired in quantity, sometimes over long distances or from a network of estates. It had to be timed against fast days and feast days. It had to be classified according to rank, use, and perishability. Bones, fat, and lesser cuts still had destinations. Waste could be significant in display culture, but no pre-modern household with any sense entirely ignored the afterlife of its food. What was not fit for the high table might feed servants, poorer dependents, or later meals in altered form. Splendor rested on a hierarchy of redistribution. That redistribution tells us something very revealing. A feast hall could gather many social levels around the same event while ensuring they did not share equally in its luxuries. The lord and chief guests might receive the best cuts, the choicest game, and the most elaborately finished dishes. Lower household members, retainers, and staff might still benefit from the occasion, but in descending degrees of quality and prestige. This mirrored the structure of society itself. Food moved downward, but dignity and privilege thinned as it moved. Here again, the documentary picture becomes richer when we resist the temptation to look only upward. For the kitchen workers, scullions, turnspits, carvers, and servers who made great meat feasts possible, the event would not have felt primarily like magnificence. It would have felt like heat, urgency, heavy lifting, grease, sharp knives, endless coordination, and the risk of public failure. Enormous roasts had to be managed over open fires. Birds had to be dressed. Sauces had to be timed. Platters had to reach the hall in the proper order. If the feast represented effortless command to the guests, it represented intense labor to those behind the doors. That split between appearance and effort is one of the deepest truths in the history of elite food. Luxury often works by concealing the labor that sustains it. Medieval banquets were no exception. In fact, because so much had to be done by hand, the gap may have been even more dramatic than in many later societies. A noble household that wished to seem naturally magnificent had to orchestrate a great many bodies. The feast was, in part, a machine for converting service into spectacle. And that machine was fed by rural production. Animals raised by tenants, rendered as dues, bought in markets supplied by surrounding villages, or hunted across privileged landscapes all converged in the household economy of display. The gleam of abundance in the hall, therefore, had a countryside behind it. Pasture, peasant rent, woodland management, butchery rights, urban regulation, carting routes, and harvest outcomes all stood invisibly behind the roasted venison or capons served at table. This is why the feast is such a powerful historical lens. It looks like pure excess, but if we read it closely, it reveals the entire structure beneath. It also reveals anxiety. However confident a feast might appear, medieval hosts knew that magnificence could be judged. Too little food suggested weakness. Poor quality suggested disorder. Clumsy service suggested inadequate household control. In a political culture where honor and reputation mattered intensely, hospitality was not just kindness. It was performance under scrutiny. Rivals, subordinates, allies, and chroniclers could all draw conclusions from what was served and how it was served. A banquet, therefore, carried risk alongside prestige. To host was to expose oneself to interpretation. That pressure helps explain why certain meats carried such symbolic charge. Venison, as we have seen, bore the prestige of privilege. Swans and peacocks, whether actually enjoyed as much as later imagination supposes or admired more for their role in display, offered rarity and visual distinction. Boar carried associations of the hunt and aristocratic vigor. Capons and fine poultry suggested careful management and refined consumption. Even beef, often more common and more substantial, could appear differently depending on the setting, the quality, and the method of presentation. No meat was neutral once it entered a ceremonial context. At the same time, medieval diners did not all approach these foods with a single palate. Preference was shaped by region, habit, medical theory, and class expectation. Some prized what we might now consider difficult. Some valued tenderness in ways that overlap with modern taste. Some appreciated strong sauces because they signaled learned and fashionable cookery. Others likely desired above all the simple reassurance of plenty. The elite feast gathered these possibilities together, but it did not erase them. Beneath the polished ritual, people still brought their own appetites and histories to the table. One of the more subtle expectation reversals here is that abundance did not always produce comfort. Great feasts could be crowded, noisy, ceremonially rigid, and exhausting. Guests had to perform as well as eat. Etiquette mattered. Seating mattered. Observation mattered. Courses could be numerous. The meal might stretch on. And the very richness of the dishes, especially in a world without modern digestive expectations, may not always have felt as pleasurable as it looked. Medieval literary and moral sources occasionally hint that the culture of excess had its critics, not only among preachers, but among those tired of vanity, pretension, or bodily consequence. In that sense, the banquet existed in tension with another ideal that remained powerful throughout the Middle Ages: moderation. Christian moral teaching praised restraint, charity, and self-command. Medical writing often warned against overburdening the body. Monastic values, even when imperfectly lived, kept alive the notion that plainness could be spiritually superior to display. So the feast table was never morally uncomplicated. It glittered, but it also invited judgment. To some, it demonstrated rightful magnificence. To others, or even to the same people on different days, it threatened pride and excess. This moral unease becomes especially visible when we look at religious institutions that became wealthy. Monasteries, cathedral chapters, and episcopal households could possess substantial resources, and with them came the possibility of better provisioning than strict spiritual ideals might seem to allow. Debates over meat in religious life were not minor dietary disagreements. They were arguments about what kind of body belonged in a holy institution and how comfort related to discipline. If monks or canons ate too richly, critics could interpret that as evidence that the institution itself had drifted from its purpose. Meat, once again, was more than food. It was a test case for a society thinking about power and virtue. The church calendar added another layer to feast culture as well. Because so many days carried restrictions, the days of permission could feel especially charged. Christmas, Easter, and other festive seasons did not merely bring special food because celebration needed decoration. They brought special food because the calendar had already taught people to experience eating in rhythms of withholding and release. A feast after abstinence is socially stronger than a feast in a culture of constant access. Medieval religious time sharpened contrasts, and in so doing it made meat more symbolically volatile. If we turn for a moment from the great hall to the town, we can see a different but related kind of spectacle. Urban markets did not stage magnificence in the same way, yet they too turned meat into a public matter. Butcher stalls, hanging carcasses, regulated weights, watched prices, and municipal concern over quality made the sale of flesh part of civic life. In a town, meat could be visible as commerce rather than ceremony. Buyers judged cuts, freshness, and fairness. Authorities worried about spoiled meat, illicit slaughter, or fraud. Guild structures in some places brought further organization and identity to the trade. This urban meat culture carried its own forms of hierarchy. Prosperous townspeople might buy more frequently, choose better cuts, or maintain more varied diets than the laboring poor. Servants might shop for affluent households while others bought scraps, offal, or less favored parts. Public sale made comparison unavoidable. One person's dinner could be seen beside another's means. Markets, therefore, did not erase inequality. They displayed it in smaller, more regular transactions. The butcher himself occupied an interesting social position. He handled an essential trade, one associated with blood, knives, waste, and bodily necessity. That gave the occupation a certain rough visibility. But it also gave it importance. A town that could not regulate slaughter and sale risked disorder in supply and fear over quality. In that sense, butchers stood at the intersection of appetite, money, and public trust. Their work reminds us again that medieval meat was embedded in institutions, not merely habits. And still, beneath both feast and market, there remained the simple issue of what a person could chew, swallow, and digest on an ordinary evening. Even in wealthy settings, not all meat was delicate. Even in towns with active markets, the poor did not always buy the prime portions. Even at banquets, the splendor of presentation could rest on animals that required heavy saucing, careful cutting, or experienced teeth. The medieval mouth encountered gristle, bone, connective tissue, salt, smoke, and strong seasoning more often than modern food imagery suggests. What looked splendid across the table may have demanded effort at the jaw. This bodily reality is easy to overlook because history is often read with the eyes rather than the mouth. Manuscript illuminations show elegant dishes. Household accounts list animals in neat lines. Literary descriptions revel in abundance. But the lived experience of eating included the awkwardness of fingers, knives, shared platters, variable quality, and the pace of a room full of other bodies. It included waiting, watching, choosing, and sometimes going without the best. Meat was social not just because people ate together, but because one person's access could be measured against another's in the same moment. There is perhaps no clearer example of that than the difference between the first serving and the leftovers. A lordly table could blaze with prestige when the dish first entered. Hours later, the remains might be cooling in a very different social world, portioned out in descending order, carried into side spaces, or transformed for the household beneath the household. Medieval meat had afterlives. Bones fed broths. Drippings fed kitchens. Leftovers fed ranks below. The feast did not end when the host finished eating. It dissolved into the broader economy of the house. That broader economy also explains why some of the most lavish meat culture was inseparable from accounting. Clerks tracked expenditures. Stewards managed provisioning. Storehouses recorded what came in and what went out. Salt, spices, wine, flour, and animals all appeared in systems of oversight because splendor without management could quickly become ruinous. The medieval great household was not merely indulging itself. It was constantly balancing honor against cost. To feed magnificently and remain solvent required discipline of a different kind, one expressed not in fasting but in administration. And as administration became more sophisticated in many parts of late medieval Europe, the record of meat consumption became more detailed as well. This allows us to see something important. The same society that glorified martial prowess, noble hunting, and ceremonial hospitality was also increasingly concerned with inventories, procurement, transport, and regulated exchange. The romance of the hunt and the arithmetic of the pantry existed side by side. A stag in the forest belonged to symbolism. A salted barrel in storage belonged to planning. Medieval meat lived between those worlds, which leads, quite naturally, to another threshold. If the grand feast showed how the powerful transformed meat into spectacle, and the market showed how towns turned it into regulated commerce, then there is still another setting where the story becomes even more intimate and revealing. It is the period when ceremony is over, the calendar has tightened again, winter has deepened, stores are being watched carefully, and what remains of the animal must last. In that quieter season, away from the feast hall and outside the market's display, we begin to see most clearly what medieval meat was when it was no longer impressive, only necessary, only necessary. In that quieter season, away from the feast hall and outside the market's display, We begin to see most clearly what medieval meat was when it was no longer impressive, only necessary. Winter has a way of stripping glamour from food history. It leaves behind storage, rationing, texture, patience, and the long negotiation between what a household hopes to save and what it can bear to consume. If people wanted meat beyond the brief triumph of slaughter time, then they needed methods that could push flesh across weeks and months without surrendering it entirely to rot. And those methods, practical as they were, changed the eating experience in profound ways. Fresh meat belongs to a narrow moment. Preserved meat belongs to a season, sometimes to a strategy, and often to a compromise. Salting was among the most important of those compromises. Salt could keep meat usable, but it also transformed it, hardening muscle, drawing out moisture, and leaving behind a flavor that was less gentle nourishment than a kind of controlled assault. To modern palates accustomed to refrigeration and standardized curing, it is easy to underestimate how forceful preserved meat could be. In the medieval world, a heavily salted piece of pork or beef was not simply dinner stored for later. It was food that demanded soaking, boiling, and adaptation before it became tolerable, let alone pleasant. That is why winter meat in medieval life was often inseparable from the pot. A preserved cut might hang as household security, but to reach the table it usually had to be coaxed back toward edibility. Water, heat, herbs, onions, leeks, beans, peas, and grains all played their part. The meat softened somewhat, the broth grew strong, the vegetables borrowed flavor, and the household, if fortunate, received something greater than the raw preserved piece could have offered alone. Here again, the most revealing point is not the meat by itself, but what it did to other foods. Medieval cookery often made one valuable thing travel through many mouths. Even this required judgment. Too much of the household's reserve used too early could make late winter harder. Too much caution, on the other hand, meant living meanly in the present for the sake of a future no one could guarantee. This balance, repeated week after week, was one of the unromantic arts of pre-modern survival. A family with a salted side of bacon did not merely possess food. It possessed choices, worries, and calculations. How much should be cut today? Which guests, if any, deserved a better meal? Should some be kept back for illness? Would the weather hold? Would Lent arrive with the stores already thinning? Lent, of course, sharpened the matter yet again. The approach of the major fast was not simply a liturgical event, but a culinary one. Households that observed it had to adjust not only their thinking but their storage habits. If flesh meat would be restricted, then whatever remained might need to be managed around those rules, or preserved longer, or traded, or left for a later return. Fish, especially preserved fish, loomed larger during these periods, and that did something curious to the cultural place of meat. It made meat more absent in a formal sense, and absence can strengthen desire. What one cannot lawfully eat for a time acquires a mental vividness that ordinary daily presence often lacks. This means that the medieval experience of meat was not only about chewing and tasting. It was also about waiting for slaughter season, waiting for feast days, waiting for restrictions to lift, waiting to see whether stores would last, waiting for markets to improve, waiting for obligations to be met. The modern consumer often experiences meat as something available first and selected second. Medieval households often experienced it as something uncertain first and precious second. That uncertainty shaped gratitude, frustration, and imagination alike. And when preserved meat finally reached the table, it did not always arrive in noble form. We should linger over this because it corrects one of the strongest visual myths about the period. Much medieval meat was not elegant. It was fibrous, uneven, salted almost to harshness, or broken into fragments that only gained dignity when submerged in a broader dish. It might be chewy from age or dry from preservation, or rich in a way that bordered on tiring when eaten repeatedly. Animal fat could be welcome, even coveted, and still become monotonous. A winter diet could be sustaining without being delightful. That is not to say medieval people lacked pleasure in eating. Far from it. Pleasant food mattered deeply, celebrations mattered, and a well-made dish could be appreciated across classes. But pleasure lived alongside repetition more closely than many modern viewers expect. One of the things preserved meat offered was reliability, and reliability is not always thrilling. It can be a gift and a burden at the same time. A household grateful to have bacon in store might also grow weary of how often the same salted note returned to the pot. Monasteries and great households had similar problems in more elaborate form. The scale was larger, the management more formal, but the basic challenge remained. How to sustain people through seasons of scarcity or restriction without allowing provisions to fail. Cellarers, stewards, and kitchen officers had to think ahead, judge quantities, monitor spoilage, and maintain discipline over stores that were tempting precisely because they were finite. A noble table could display abundance in public, but behind that display stood storerooms where meat was counted, watched, and worried over. In this sense, the most impressive feast and the most modest cottage both depended on the same underlying truth. Preserved meat was never just food. It was time held uneasily in reserve. Smoking added another layer to that reserve. Smoked meats could keep longer and develop flavors that, to some palates, would have felt rich and comforting. Yet smoke in the medieval context was not a fashionable signature chosen from a menu. It was bound to architecture, fuel, weather, and preservation practice. Meat hanging in smoke gathered something of the household itself. The same world that blackened rafters and clung to clothing also entered the food. The smell of a medieval home, the smell of its fire, and the smell of its provisions were closely related. In that environment, taste was never completely separable from dwelling. There is something almost intimate in that. To eat preserved meat in winter was, in a sense, to taste one's own household economy. The pig raised, slaughtered, salted, and hung under one roof or within one village did not come to the table as anonymous merchandise. Came with memory attached. People knew when it had been killed, who had worked on it, how the salt had been obtained, whether the cure seemed to be holding, whether the stores looked generous or alarmingly thin. Modern food often hides its past. Medieval preserved meat carried its past into the room. That intimacy extended to parts of the animal modern eaters sometimes prefer not to imagine. If the whole creature had value, then preserved meat culture did not limit itself to ideal cuts. Heads, feet, blood, organs, skin, and rendered fat all belong to the broader system of use. Some might be consumed immediately after slaughter, when they were freshest and hardest to preserve. Others became sausages, puddings, or broths. Nothing about this was theatrical. It was household intelligence under pressure. And because waste was costly, the medieval table often preserved forms of culinary realism that later wealth would allow people to forget. Offal is especially revealing here. In many times and places, organs could be highly valued, but they could also be associated with immediacy, perishability, and the practical urgency of slaughter. They demanded prompt use. That meant some of the richest, strongest, or least refined eating happened closest to the moment of killing, not months later in the calm of winter. A household might enjoy fresh liver, blood sausage, or other quickly prepared foods at slaughter time precisely because such things could not wait. This complicates the usual hierarchy of fresh versus preserved. Sometimes the most intense flavors belong to the brief, chaotic hours when the animal first entered the human food system. The social differences did not disappear in winter, but winter could blur them in interesting ways. A great lord might still eat better than a peasant, with more variety, more seasoning, more fish alternatives on fast days, and more reliable access to good cuts. Yet cold weather, preservation limits, and the length of the season imposed a common material logic. Even high tables could not entirely escape salt, smoke, repetition, and storage anxiety. Privilege changed the experience, but it did not abolish the season. This is one reason medieval food can feel, at moments, both deeply unequal and oddly shared. The same winter pressed on everyone, though not with equal force. Still, equal force was not the point. The poor had far less cushion when provisions ran low. For them, the difference between having meat as a regular flavoring and not having it at all could be enormous. Animal fat in pottage, a small piece of bacon cooked with beans, or broth made from bones might help create the sense of a proper meal. Without those things, food could feel thinner in every sense. This emotional dimension matters. Fullness is physical, but so is comfort, and medieval people knew the difference between a bare bowl and a richer one even when modern nutritional categories do not quite capture that feeling. There is also the matter of work. Winter did not end labor. Animals still needed care, would had to be cut, tools maintained, clothing repaired, roads and paths managed as best they could be. And in some places transport and market activity continued despite mud, snow, or bitter cold. The body still needed fuel. Meat, or more often the fats and flavor it contributed, remained part of how people endured physically demanding lives. If we think only in terms of prestige, we miss this simpler but more important reality. Medieval meat was often less about culinary excitement than about making hard existence slightly more bearable. This is where the question of age and animal type returns in a particularly concrete way. An old cow killed after years of dairy work was not the same eating experience as a young pig raised more directly for meat. Mutton from mature sheep had different qualities from lamb. Toughness, fiber, and flavor intensity varied. These were not subtle gourmet distinctions but practical realities that shaped cooking. The same household that might one season preserve pork with relative confidence could face a very different problem when an older working animal finally entered the food supply. Such meat was valuable, yes, but not always immediately lovable. The cook's role in mediating that difficulty cannot be overstated. Medieval cuisine, especially in its humbler forms, was full of techniques for making the stubborn edible and the limited sufficient. Boiling, pounding, mincing, thickening, souring, spicing when possible, and pairing meat with bread-based sauces or grain dishes were all ways of negotiating with matter. Medieval people did not live in a culinary world of endlessly tender cuts. They lived in one where ingenuity met resistance at the hearth every day. And that ingenuity was informed not only by necessity, but by inherited ideas of the body. Learned medicine continued to shape elite and semi-elite understandings of which meats were suitable for whom, in what season, and in what condition of health. Winter itself could alter the imagined fitness of a dish. Richer foods might be thought more suitable in cold weather, while delicate bodies, the old, the sick, or the convalescent might require gentler preparations. Broth took on a special importance here. It could carry nourishment in a softened form, standing somewhere between solid food and remedy. In a world where meat was precious, to turn it into broth for the weak was both practical and meaningful. That raises a subtle but human point. Meat in medieval life was not only collective, ceremonial, or economic. Could also become personal at moments of illness. A weakened body, unable to chew much or hold down heavy food, might still be sustained by a carefully prepared stock, a modest bird, or a restorative pottage enriched with animal substance. The same culture that associated meat with status and feast also understood that certain forms of animal nourishment could belong beside the bed of someone who needed strength. This did not erase inequalities, but it does remind us that the emotional life of food extended beyond the table. In towns, meanwhile, winter meat could sharpen old concerns about supply and honesty. Preserved goods moved through markets, and so did suspicion. Had meat been properly cured? Was it older than the seller admitted? Had scarcity encouraged dishonesty? Urban governments and guild structures often tried to supervise such matters not out of abstract bureaucratic love of rules, but because meat touched civic confidence directly. A town where people feared the butcher's wares was a town where basic trust in provisioning had begun to fray. The sale of flesh was therefore part commerce, part public order, part moral theater. And even when markets functioned well, not everyone bought the same things. Better-off households could purchase finer pieces or more reliable goods. Poorer buyers might settle for cheaper cuts, scraps, or parts other customers disdained. That is another way in which winter reveals the truth of the subject. When abundance fades and preservation dominates, hierarchy often becomes even more visible. Wealth buys not only more food, but less unpleasant food. It buys variety when others live with sameness. It buys relief from the coarsest textures and strongest salt. To speak of medieval meat without speaking of discomfort would therefore be misleading. Discomfort, though, is not quite the same as misery, and it would be too simple to flatten the whole picture into grim endurance. There were still moments of pleasure, skill, and local pride. A village might have its own well-regarded sausages or curing methods. A household might look forward to a particular winter dish. A monastery might produce smoked or salted provisions with notable competence. Familiar food can be loved even when it is repetitive. In fact, repetition sometimes deepens attachment. The return of a certain broth, a certain cut, a certain festival preparation after weeks of restraint may have felt not dull but reassuring, a marker that the season was unfolding as it should. This is where the emotional realism of medieval food becomes especially important. People did not spend their lives comparing their meals to modern supermarket abundance. They lived within their own expectations, hopes, and inherited standards. A salted pork dish that seems harsh to us might have signified security to them. A modest serving of meat on a feast day might have carried excitement because it broke routine. A broth from bones might have mattered not only nutritionally but symbolically, because it meant the household still had resources to draw on. Historical understanding improves when we stop asking whether medieval food was good by modern terms and start asking what it meant inside medieval life. And inside that life, the line between necessity and prestige was never far away. The same pig could produce lard for poor winter meals and, in another household or another form, contribute to a lordly display. The same deer that symbolized privilege in a park could, if poached, become emergency sustenance and social crime at once. The same salted fish that replaced flesh on fast days could be ordinary fare for some and carefully selected import for others. Medieval food was layered because medieval society was layered, and meat, perhaps more than any other category, carried those layers visibly. As late winter turned toward spring, that layered world grew tense in new ways. Stores were often lower. The memory of slaughter season had dimmed. New grass and fresh growth had not yet fully repaired what months of consumption had worn down. This was the hungry edge of the year in many agrarian societies, when the promise of renewal was visible but not yet edible in abundance. In such weeks, meat could become rarer, more carefully rationed, or absent altogether for those at the bottom. Even households with some reserve had reasons to be cautious. The year, after all, had to turn successfully before confidence could return. And it is precisely there, at that narrow hinge between dwindling stores and the hope of fresh abundance, that another side of the medieval meat story begins to emerge. Because if winter taught people how to preserve flesh, spring and summer forced them to think again about animals not as stored food, but as living capital, breeding stock, dairy providers, and laboring bodies whose greatest value often lay in not being eaten yet. And because if winter taught people how to preserve flesh, spring and summer forced them to think again about animals not as stored food, but as living capital, breeding stock, dairy providers, and laboring bodies whose greatest value often lay in not being eaten yet. This is one of the central contradictions at the heart of medieval meat consumption, and once you notice it, the whole subject becomes clearer. In a society where animals were precious, meat was often most desired at precisely those moments when killing an animal made the least long-term sense. Spring was not, for most households, a season of carefree abundance. It was a season of watching, counting, and hoping. Lambs, calves, piglets, chicks, and goslings represented future possibilities. Milk began to matter again in fresher and more immediate ways. Eggs returned in greater quantity. Fields required labor. Plow animals were indispensable. The household's attention turned toward growth, reproduction, and recovery from the long strain of winter. Under those conditions, slaughtering too freely could be a kind of self-harm disguised as dinner. A family might long for fresh meat, yet know perfectly well that keeping the animal alive was the wiser act. This is where the modern assumption that pre-modern people simply ate whatever animals they had nearby becomes especially misleading. In reality, the presence of animals around a medieval home often meant restraint rather than easy access to meat. A cow in the yard was not a standing roast. It was milk, manure, future calves, and possibly the traction needed to sustain a farm economy. Sheep were walking stores of wool long before they became mutton. Poultry provided eggs before they provided flesh. Even a pig, perhaps the animal most closely tied to peasant meat consumption in many regions, still required timing. To slaughter too soon was to waste potential fat and flesh. To wait too long could create feed pressure or risk other losses. Medieval households did not merely raise animals. They negotiated with them. That negotiation varied by status and region, of course, but the principle was widespread. Meat was often delayed by usefulness. In that sense, the real calendar of medieval meat was not simply the church calendar, though that mattered greatly. It was also the biological calendar of animals and the agricultural calendar of households. The church might forbid meat on certain days. The farm might discourage it on many others. Between sacred rule and practical rule, the ideal of constant meat eating was narrowed from both sides. The result was a food culture in which secondary animal products often mattered more steadily than flesh itself. Milk, butter, cheese, curds, eggs, dripping, and fat could provide regular value where meat remained occasional. This does not mean those foods were easy to obtain in unlimited quantities. Milk production was seasonal and vulnerable. Cheese required skill, time, and appropriate conditions. Butter could be precious and regionally variable. Eggs fluctuated. But these products remind us again that medieval diets were animal-linked even when actual meat portions were sparse. To understand how people lived, we have to see the whole animal economy, not just the moments of slaughter. And that animal economy shaped how people thought about taste. Fresh spring foods, where available, could feel different not only because they were new, but because they arrived after months of stored provisions and narrow routines. The palate itself must have experienced the year as a kind of cycle of compression and release. A fresh egg, a little milk, a younger bird, herbs returning to the garden, early greens in the pot. These things altered the meaning of a meal, sometimes more than a large quantity of coarse preserved meat would have done. Medieval food pleasure was often seasonal before it was extravagant. That does not mean flesh meat vanished from spring and summer life. Wealthier households could still secure it more regularly, markets continued to function, and local conditions varied. But even the rich operated within the logic of live animals as assets. A noble estate might have more flexibility, more herds, and more purchasing power, yet it still depended on breeding, dairying, laboring animals, and the careful management of stock. The lord who dined well in May did not do so because medieval nature simply poured meat onto his table. He did so because a managed estate, a network of tenants, market ties, and household administration converted living resources into a selective flow of flesh. And perhaps that is the deeper theme emerging here. Medieval meat was rarely casual. Even when it appeared abundant, it was usually the result of decisions that involved sacrifice somewhere in the system. To eat a chicken was to forego future eggs from that bird. To kill a calf might mean foregoing later milk or traction, depending on the sex and purpose of the animal. These were not abstract dilemmas. They were household realities, estate realities, and sometimes village realities. This is one reason why famine and dearth could be so structurally damaging. In a hard year, people might be driven to eat what they would rather have preserved as future capacity. A family forced by hunger to slaughter essential livestock was not simply obtaining food. It was spending tomorrow to survive today. Medieval chroniclers, manorial records, and later observers of agrarian distress all point, in various ways, to this brutal arithmetic. Crisis diets could look like temporary adaptation, but they often carried long shadows. Once breeding stock vanished or plow animals were lost, recovery became harder even when weather improved. For the poor, then, meat could be painfully double-edged. The emergency meal that saved a family through 1 week might worsen the next season. A lordly feast could absorb many animals without threatening the lord's existence. A peasant household could not do the same. Scale altered everything. This is why the same act, slaughter, has to be read differently depending on who was doing it. At one end of society, it might be display. At the other, desperation. In the middle, it might be calculation, ritual, or household management. The animal died in each case, but the social meaning of its death was not the same. Spring and summer also remind us that the medieval relationship with meat was deeply ecological. Animals needed pasture, fodder, water, and shelter. Their value depended on weather and land use. A dry season could weaken herds. Wet conditions could spread disease or reduce hay quality. Woodland access shaped swine raising. Common rights affected who could graze and where. Meadowland mattered because hay mattered, and hay mattered because winter feeding determined whether animals survived long enough to remain useful. Even when a person sat down to eat a small piece of meat, the real story behind that bite might begin months earlier in a field, a meadow, or a legal dispute over access. That ecological dependence also meant that meat availability was woven into local conflicts. Commons, forests, marshes, and meadows were not scenic backdrops. They were productive spaces, and rights over them mattered enormously. A peasant's ability to fatten a pig, keep a few sheep, or maintain a cow might depend on customary access that could be challenged, narrowed, or taxed. A lord's attempts to assert control over woodland or pasture could therefore affect diets directly, not in some distant theoretical sense, but at the level of whether a household could maintain the very animals that might one day be eaten. Land rights became meat rights, though often after a long and invisible chain of consequences. This is especially interesting when we consider how much medieval social order depended on making hierarchy appear natural. A noble household's well-supplied table could seem like the natural expression of noble status. Yet behind it were highly structured relations of control over land, dues, markets, labor, and legal privilege. The peasant's thinner table could likewise be read, by those in power, as the ordinary condition of life. But neither table was natural in any simple sense. Both were made. Both were political. And meat, because it was so visible and so desired, made those underlying arrangements easier to feel. There is another subtle reversal here too. We often imagine meat as the most direct form of nourishment, something straightforward and substantial. But in medieval life, flesh was often the least stable part of the animal economy. Milk could recur. Eggs could recur. Wool renewed itself. Labor could continue day after day. Meat arrived with finality. Once eaten, the animal's other possibilities ended. that meant a world dependent on careful continuity had reasons not to turn every useful creature into immediate protein. The everyday medieval economy was, in that sense, less meat-centered than its own prestige culture sometimes pretended. Prestige culture, however, was loud enough to leave a lasting impression. Hunting, feasting, and ceremonial hospitality all encouraged later audiences to imagine a meat-heavy Middle Ages dominated by noble appetites. And because literacy, art, and record survival often tilt toward elite experience, that impression has endured. Yet if we ask what medieval people most often lived, rather than what they most often commemorated, a different picture emerges. Most households spent much more time keeping animals alive than eating them. The life of meat was preceded, and often outweighed, by the management of not meat. This is also why young animals occupied such an emotionally and economically charged position. Veal, lamb, kid, suckling pig, and tender poultry could be prized foods, especially among the well-off. They offered softness, digestibility, and status, but their desirability rested partly on what poorer households could less easily justify. To eat the young was often to choose immediate refinement over future yield. In elite settings, that could be a display of freedom from ordinary constraints. In humbler settings, it might be wasteful unless compelled by circumstance. The tenderness admired on the high table was not only a matter of palate. It was also a matter of power. Medical thinking gave this further complexity. Younger meats were often regarded in learned traditions as easier to digest and more appropriate for certain constitutions or conditions. Delicate birds and young animals might be recommended for the sick or for refined tables. Heavy beef or mature mutton could be treated as more robust, more demanding, perhaps better suited to strong bodies or specific contexts. However unevenly such ideas were followed in practice, they reinforced a social division already present in economic life. The foods considered most gentle and superior were often those whose production required the least compromise with survival pressures. By contrast, the meat more available to ordinary people, when available at all, was often from older, tougher, more utilitarian animals. This does not mean peasants always ate badly prepared food, nor that they had no culinary pride. It simply means that their ingredients more often came from animals whose prime value had already been extracted in other ways. A hen after her laying years, a sheep after useful wool seasons, a cow after dairy life. Such creatures entered the pot carrying the memory of work. Medieval meat was frequently retrospective. It was the final chapter of an animal's usefulness, not the first purpose for which the animal had existed. That practical reality shaped cooking methods but also social imagination. Fresh, tender, selective meat could signify freedom from necessity. Tougher meat, simmered for hours, reflected a household that knew how to wring value from the end stages of utility. One is not morally nobler than the other by default, but they belong to different material conditions. When modern audiences imagine medieval peasants tearing into endless rustic roasts, they miss how much medieval cooking was shaped by fatigue, thrift, and the need to make difficult flesh feed several people. Summer brought its own complications as well. Heat increased the problem of spoilage. Without easy preservation, fresh meat had to be used quickly. This did not make summer a season without slaughter, but it did make it a season in which preservation challenges could alter both quantity and quality. Fish and dairy might assume greater local importance in some areas. Poultry and smaller animals could be used more flexibly. Markets had to move goods efficiently. A large animal killed at the wrong moment could present more danger than convenience if a household lacked the means to process it quickly. Again, the simple act of having meat available was never the whole story. In towns, these seasonal realities were mediated through market infrastructure, urban regulation, and professional butchery. An affluent town dweller might enjoy more reliable access to fresh cuts than a villager dependent on household stock. Yet urban life had its own fragility. Supply depended on surrounding regions, drovers, political stability, and the smooth movement of animals and goods. Warm weather increased anxieties about quality. Municipal rules governing slaughter locations, stall conduct, and sale practices were not bureaucratic curiosities. They were attempts to keep one of the most sensitive parts of the food system from sliding into danger or distrust. The town butcher, then, stood inside a world of seasonal pressure no less than the villager did, though differently. He or she handled flesh at the point where immediacy mattered most. A summer carcass could not wait long. Customers judged with their eyes and noses. Authorities judged with fines and ordinances. Reputation mattered. So did speed. The butcher's trade reminds us that medieval meat was perishable not only biologically, but socially. Confidence in it could evaporate quickly. Meanwhile, in noble and royal contexts, the seasonal challenge often produced more elaborate solutions rather than simpler ones. Wealth allowed for diversified provisioning. Estates in different locations, fish ponds, hunting preserves, storage systems, and more regular access to servants and transport could soften the impact of any one local shortage. But they could not abolish seasonality altogether. A great household still had to plan around what could be fresh, what must be preserved, what the church allowed, and what the social occasion required. Grandeur widened the options. It did not create modern permanence. This is perhaps one of the most instructive truths in the whole documentary. Medieval inequality was immense, but medieval material limits were still real. The rich did not live as modern consumers in costume. They lived as rich medieval people, which is not the same thing. Their meat was more abundant, more selective, more elegantly cooked, and more symbolically powerful. Yet it remained vulnerable to weather, disease, religious rhythm, transport, and storage. When we keep that in view, the period becomes both more foreign and more understandable. People were divided by wealth, but united, however unequally, by a world that resisted easy abundance. That resistance also shaped memory, and memory matters because medieval people carried food expectations across years. A good season taught one set of habits, a bad one another. Households remembered when stores failed, when a pig fattened well, when Murrin took cattle, when salt was dear, when a lord remitted dues or pressed them hard. Such memories influenced not only how food was managed, but how events were judged. A ruler's policies, a steward's competence, a village custom, a monastery's charity, all could be measured against bodily outcomes. Did people feel fed? Did they feel secure? Did the household seem prudent? Meat, because it was so charged, became one of the clearest measures of such judgments. We should not underestimate the symbolic weight of that. To serve meat could mean honor. To withhold it could signal discipline. To lack it could feel like hardship. To display it could proclaim rank. To steal it could become moral drama. To preserve it well could suggest competence. To waste it could imply folly. Few foods carried so many meanings at once. Grain may have been more foundational in sheer caloric terms, but meat was often more expressive. It told stories about authority, piety, fortune, and survival in ways people could feel immediately in the mouth and stomach. And yet, the closer we move to the household level, the more those large meanings condense into very quiet scenes. A woman cutting a small piece of bacon into a pot. A steward deciding whether to slaughter now or wait. A sick man receiving broth rather than solid meat. A servant carrying a platter past lower tables to the high one. A poacher weighing hunger against risk. A monk hearing the reading in refectory while wondering whether the rule would bend for the infirmary. A child noticing that feast days smell different from ordinary days. History often announces itself through kings and battles, but food history often moves by these smaller recognitions. That is why the subject remains so absorbing. The question was not simply what kind of meat existed, but what kind of society one had to live in to taste it in one form rather than another. The distance between venison in a noble hall and salted scraps in a peasant pottage was not only culinary. It was the distance between legal privilege and labor, between ceremony and endurance, between choice and necessity. And because those distances were built into the structure of medieval life, the experience of meat became a kind of daily education in hierarchy. Even children would have learned that education early. They learned it through which foods appeared when guests visited, which foods vanished during fasts, which animals were protected, which were household assets, and which parts were reserved for whom. They learned that not every creature in sight was there to be eaten. They learned that hunger did not automatically produce permission. They learned that a feast belonged to a calendar and to a rank. In that way, meat was also pedagogy. It taught people their place not abstractly, but through repetition. And yet places could shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes sharply. By the later medieval centuries, demographic shocks, labor shortages in certain regions, urban growth, commercialization, and local variations in prosperity began to alter some consumption patterns. In some places and periods, ordinary people could gain better access to certain foods than earlier assumptions would suggest. In others, pressure and inequality remained severe. The point is not to tell a simple story of steady improvement or unbroken hardship, but to notice that medieval meat culture was historically dynamic. It changed with population, land use, wages, trade, and catastrophe. That dynamism becomes especially important once plague and demographic collapse enter the picture, because then the relationship between labor, land, livestock, and diet can shift in surprising ways. But before we move there, we have to stay for a little longer with the pre-plague world, with its crowded fields, tightening claims, noble appetites, and households still balancing each animal between present hunger and future need. Because it is on that edge of tension that the next transformation begins. Because it is on that edge of tension that the next transformation begins. In the centuries before the great mid-14th century demographic shock, much of medieval Europe was living under a pressure that helps explain a great deal about meat without ever mentioning the dinner table directly. Population had grown. In many regions, land had been pushed hard. Marginal soils were brought under cultivation. Forests and rough pasture had been reduced in some places to make room for grain. And when grain cultivation expands under pressure, animal keeping often has to fight for room. That matters because meat does not begin in the kitchen. It begins in the landscape's willingness to spare land, fodder, and labor for animals that are not immediately feeding the plow team or filling the dairy pail. This is one of the deeper practical reasons why the medieval diet, for so many ordinary people, remained so cautious in its relationship to flesh meat. A densely peopled agrarian society under pressure tends to privilege calories that can be produced more directly. Grain, though vulnerable and never simple, could support more people per acre than large-scale meat production. Livestock still mattered enormously, of course, but their role had to be balanced against human need for bread, ale, porridge, and seed. In a crowded countryside, the question was not merely whether people liked meat. The question was whether the economy could afford to provide very much of it to very many people on a regular basis. That is why medieval meat often feels most abundant precisely where population density, social privilege, or ecological conditions bent the rules. Noble hunting parks, monastic estates with broad holdings, well-managed manors with access to meadow and woodland, and urban households wealthy enough to buy into the market all occupied positions that shielded them, at least partly, from the harsher arithmetic faced by the rural poor. Yet even there, the arithmetic never disappeared entirely. It simply became mediated by rent, law, exchange, and status. One household solved the problem of meat by owning parkland. Another solved it by buying from someone else who did not. In villages, the pressure of population could make animal keeping feel narrower and more precarious. Smallholders and cottagers might keep few animals, or depend heavily on common rights to make those animals viable. A pig could matter intensely because it made use of scraps, mast, and household resources in ways larger stock could not. A few hens might be realistic where cattle were difficult. A cow, where one could be maintained, was often treasured for milk more than anticipated for beef. Sheep might be desirable, but their management depended on land arrangements not every household could command easily. These are quiet economic truths, but they shaped what eating meat really meant at ground level. And they shaped it psychologically as well. In a household with only one pig or one cow or a handful of birds, the animals were not background scenery. They were familiar, watched, counted, and often discussed. A child might know exactly which hen was still laying and which seemed weaker. A family might debate when a pig had reached the right stage to kill. An ox's health could be the difference between timely plowing and dangerous delay. In that world, meat was not impersonal inventory. It emerged from living creatures whose economic roles were visible to everyone. That visibility made slaughter practical, but it could also make it weighty. That is why the subject remains so absorbing. The question was not simply what kind of meat existed, but what kind of society one had to live in to taste it in one form rather than another. The distance between venison in a noble hall and salted scraps in a peasant pottage was not only culinary. It was the distance between legal privilege and labor, between ceremony and endurance, between choice and necessity. And because those distances were built into the structure of medieval life, the experience of meat became a kind of daily education in hierarchy. Even children would have learned that education early. They learned it through which foods appeared when guests visited, which foods vanished during fasts, which animals were protected, which were household assets, and which parts were reserved for whom. They learned that not every creature in sight was there to be eaten. They learned that hunger did not automatically produce permission. They learned that a feast belonged to a calendar and to a rank. In that way, meat was also pedagogy. It taught people their place not abstractly, but through repetition. And yet places could shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes sharply. By the later medieval centuries, demographic shocks, labor shortages in certain regions, urban growth, commercialization, and local variations in prosperity began to alter some consumption patterns. In some places and periods, ordinary people could gain better access to certain foods than earlier assumptions would suggest. In others, pressure and inequality remained severe. The point is not to tell a simple story of steady improvement or unbroken hardship, but to notice that medieval meat culture was historically dynamic. It changed with population, land use, wages, trade, and catastrophe. That dynamism becomes especially important once plague and demographic collapse enter the picture, because then the relationship between labor, land, livestock, and diet can shift in surprising ways. But before we move there, we have to stay for a little longer with the pre-plague world, with its crowded fields, tightening claims, noble appetites, and households still balancing each animal between present hunger and future need. Because it is on that edge of tension that the next transformation begins. Because it is on that edge of tension that the next transformation begins. In the centuries before the great mid-14th century demographic shock, much of medieval Europe was living under a pressure that helps explain a great deal about meat without ever mentioning the dinner table directly. Population had grown. In many regions, land had been pushed hard. Marginal soils were brought under cultivation. Forests and rough pasture had been reduced in some places to make room for grain. And when grain cultivation expands under pressure, animal keeping often has to fight for room. That matters because meat does not begin in the kitchen. It begins in the landscape's willingness to spare land, fodder, and labor for animals that are not immediately feeding the plow team or filling the dairy pail. This is one of the deeper practical reasons why the medieval diet, for so many ordinary people, remained so cautious in its relationship to flesh meat. A densely peopled agrarian society under pressure tends to privilege calories that can be produced more directly. Grain, though vulnerable and never simple, could support more people per acre than large-scale meat production. Livestock still mattered enormously, of course, but their role had to be balanced against human need for bread, ale, porridge, and seed. In a crowded countryside, the question was not merely whether people liked meat. The question was whether the economy could afford to provide very much of it to very many people on a regular basis. That is why medieval meat often feels most abundant precisely where population density, social privilege, or ecological conditions bent the rules. Noble hunting parks, monastic estates with broad holdings, well-managed manors with access to meadow and woodland, and urban households wealthy enough to buy into the market all occupied positions that shielded them, at least partly, from the harsher arithmetic faced by the rural poor. Yet even there, the arithmetic never disappeared entirely. It simply became mediated by rent, law, exchange, and status. One household solved the problem of meat by owning parkland. Another solved it by buying from someone else who did not. In villages, the pressure of population could make animal keeping feel narrower and more precarious. Smallholders and cottagers might keep few animals, or depend heavily on common rights to make those animals viable. A pig could matter intensely because it made use of scraps, mast, and household resources in ways larger stock could not. A few hens might be realistic where cattle were difficult. A cow, where one could be maintained, was often treasured for milk more than anticipated for beef. Sheep might be desirable, but their management depended on land arrangements not every household could command easily. These are quiet economic truths, but they shaped what eating meat really meant at ground level. And they shaped it psychologically as well. In a household with only one pig or one cow or a handful of birds, the animals were not background scenery. They were familiar, watched, counted, and often discussed. A child might know exactly which hen was still laying and which seemed weaker. A family might debate when a pig had reached the right stage to kill. An ox's health could be the difference between timely plowing and dangerous delay. In that world, meat was not impersonal inventory. It emerged from living creatures whose economic roles were visible to everyone. That visibility made slaughter practical, but it could also make it weighty. This is one of those hidden reasons that the glamorous image of medieval flesh-eating feels so incomplete. The story is not simply that peasants had less and nobles had more. It is that the whole system connected meat to wider vulnerabilities in land, weather, labor, and social power. A bad season might not remove venison from a lord's table, but it could make a smallholder decide whether to part with the pig that would have salted the winter pot. In that decision, the imbalance of the age becomes almost painfully tangible. At the same time, medieval people were not passive inside these pressures. They used skill, custom, reciprocity, and local knowledge to adapt. Neighbors helped one another, though unevenly. Rights were defended in courts and through collective memory. Households diversified where they could. Gardens, poultry, dairy, gleaning, fishing, and small-scale trade all mattered. Meat, in that wider context, belonged to a bundle of strategies. It was not the only path to survival, nor always the most important one. Sometimes what mattered most was not a roast, but a bit of lard, a cheese set well, a goose saved for a key season, or the chance to cure one pig properly. This makes medieval food culture more subtle than the simple opposition between vegetarian poor and meat-feasting rich. Many ordinary people lived in diets that were intermittently animal-rich in small ways rather than consistently meat-rich in obvious ones. They may have eaten little fresh flesh in some periods, yet still depended meaningfully on bacon, dripping, dairy, eggs, or occasional slaughter. Their diet could be modest without being meatless. And when they did eat flesh, it often mattered precisely because it was woven into work, season, and household strategy rather than purchased thoughtlessly. The emotional world attached to that strategy should not be underestimated. A pig successfully raised through the year and slaughtered at the right moment could bring relief, pride, and a sense of competence. A household that managed its stores wisely might feel not abundance, exactly, but a guarded confidence. By contrast, losing an animal to disease or being forced to sell it prematurely could feel like a personal and economic wound. Medieval meat was therefore charged with feeling long before it became flavor. It embodied hope, prudence, fear, and the memory of labor. Even elite households, in their own way, felt something similar, though filtered through scale and administration. Great estates worried about disease, provisioning, and shortage too, even if they possessed better buffers. Their meat culture was more spectacular, but it was still rooted in the health of flocks and herds, the competence of stewards, and the condition of tenants whose labor underpinned estate wealth. A baron might not fear hunger in the same way as a category, but a badly managed estate could still fail in prestige, hospitality, or solvency. The large household lived farther from the edge, but not outside the system. That wider dependence becomes clearer when we consider monasteries and ecclesiastical institutions. Their relationship with meat could be morally ambivalent and practically complex. Many religious rules imposed restrictions on flesh meat, especially for monks in ordinary circumstances, though these varied by order, region, and time. Yet monasteries were also landlords, agricultural managers, and institutional feeders of sizable communities. They kept stock, managed fisheries, received rents, and had to think seriously about provisioning the healthy, the sick, the elderly, guests, and workers. Their food systems reveal again that medieval meat cannot be reduced either to indulgence or abstinence. It was always entangled with structure. Within a monastery, meat's presence or absence could become a moral signal. To deny it might express discipline. To permit it for the infirm might express care. To take too much pleasure in it could invite criticism. To manage it poorly could suggest administrative weakness. So even when meat was limited, it remained symbolically active. That is one reason food disputes in religious settings can seem so charged in the records. People were not arguing only about dinner. They were arguing about what kind of institution they believed themselves to be. The same is true in another register of towns. Urbanization did not magically democratize meat, but it did alter how many people encountered it. In towns, animal flesh was increasingly mediated through trade, guild practice, regulation, and cash purchase. A household that did not raise animals could still buy meat, at least occasionally, if wages or resources permitted. That created new opportunities and new vulnerabilities. Meat could be accessed more flexibly, but it was now subject to price fluctuations, market quality, and the reliability of supply chains from the countryside. The town dweller was not freer from the animal economy. He was simply connected to it by different means, and urban culture intensified comparison. In a village, households knew one another's stock and circumstances intimately. In a town, social difference appeared at the stall, in the cut purchased, in whether meat was bought at all, in how often it appeared in workshops, inns, or domestic kitchens. A prosperous merchant's table and a laborer's table might stand only streets apart, but the gap in texture, frequency, and choice could be striking. Medieval meat was visible inequality made edible in public. All of this sets the stage for the enormous disruption to come. Because when plague strikes a world already structured by tight land use, social hierarchy, selective meat access, and the constant balancing of animals between work and slaughter, the effects are not limited to mortality. They reach into wages, pasture, prices, household confidence, labor bargaining, and what kinds of food become possible or desirable afterward. The irony is profound. One of the greatest catastrophes in medieval history would, in some regions and for some survivors, reshape everyday diets in ways that later observers might interpret as improved access to meat. But that change would emerge not from progress in any comforting sense, rather from death rearranging the balance between people, land, and animals. Before we move fully into that altered landscape, it helps to pause at the threshold and picture the old order one last time in its ordinary rhythm. Spring animals too useful to kill, summer spoilage pressing against opportunity, autumn slaughter bringing brief concentration and labor, winter preservation hardening flesh into endurance, feast days lifting the table into ceremony, fast days pulling it back into discipline, lords turning privilege into venison, peasants turning prudence into bacon, towns turning flesh into commerce, monasteries turning it into a question of conscience. In that repeating cycle, medieval meat was never merely eaten. It was managed, interpreted, argued over, and endured. And then, in the middle of the 14th century, the cycle itself begins to break, not all at once and not everywhere in precisely the same way, but deeply enough that the relationship between people and animal food will no longer feel governed by quite the same old constraints. And then, in the middle of the 14th century, the cycle itself begins to break, not all at once and not everywhere in precisely the same way, but deeply enough that the relationship between people and animal food will no longer feel governed by quite the same old constraints. The Black Death is often described in terms of mortality, fear, abandoned streets, and spiritual crisis, and rightly so. But if we follow the quieter line of this documentary, the line that runs through fields, pastures, kitchens, and winter stores, then plague also appears as a force that rearranged the material grammar of eating. When population collapses and land remains, the old balance between mouths and resources changes. Not kindly, not neatly, and never equally, but unmistakably. Before the plague, many medieval communities lived in a condition where human pressure on land kept options narrow. After the plague, in many regions, there were fewer people to feed, fewer hands to work, abandoned holdings, disrupted customary relations, and a countryside in which pasture could sometimes expand where cultivation had once been pushed to its limit. This did not produce universal prosperity, nor did it instantly transform poor laborers into well-fed consumers of choice meat. The shock was too violent and the aftermath too uneven for such a tidy story. But it did alter possibilities. In some places, survivors found themselves with greater leverage, better wages, or access to land on terms that would have been much harder to imagine before. And when access changes, diet can change with it. This is one of the most intriguing reversals in medieval food history. A catastrophe of staggering scale helped create conditions in which some ordinary people, at least in certain regions and for certain periods, could eat somewhat better, including in their access to animal products and meat. That does not make the plague a blessing. It means only that demographic collapse can disturb old patterns of scarcity. Less pressure on grain land could encourage more pasture. Better wages could make market purchases more feasible. Lords struggling to hold tenants might offer better terms. Households with improved bargaining power could sometimes keep or acquire animals more securely. The old tightness loosened, though never for everyone at once and never beyond the reach of politics and coercion. Indeed, one of the first things elites often tried to do after plague was stop the loosening. Labor shortages gave surviving workers leverage, and that made employers, landlords, and governments uneasy. Attempts to freeze wages, enforce old obligations, and restrain mobility reveal that the social order understood perfectly well what was at stake. More bargaining power for ordinary people did not only threaten profit. It threatened hierarchy. And because diet is one of the clearest ways hierarchy becomes visible, changes in food consumption could carry social charge far beyond the kitchen. There are scattered signs, both direct and indirect, that post-plague populations in some regions consumed more meat or better animal foods than before, especially among laboring groups whose wages rose relative to prices. Again, care is necessary here. Europe was not one economy. and the later Middle Ages were full of regional instability, war, taxation, and renewed hardship. But the broad possibility matters. A laborer with improved wages might buy meat more often in town. A village household with access to more pasture or less crowded commons might maintain animals more effectively. More land per head could mean more flexibility in how much room the economy granted to livestock. Where the pre-plague world had often forced the poor to choose caution over appetite, the post-plague world sometimes widened the gap between what they wanted and what they could plausibly attain. This widening did not erase difference between classes. Lords still hunted. Great households still feasted. Monasteries and towns still had their own provisioning structures. But the psychological distance between elite and non-elite food could narrow in modest but meaningful ways. If ordinary people ate more meat, even occasionally, or more regularly enjoyed bacon, cheese, butter, or market-bought flesh, that changed the texture of daily life. It also changed expectation. Once a household has experienced a slightly richer diet, even for a generation or two, memory and demand adjust. What was once a rare comfort may begin to feel like something one ought to have. That shift in expectation helps explain why later medieval and early modern authorities sometimes sound anxious about consumption. When people lower in the social order begin to dress better, eat better, or imitate elite habits even partially, moral commentary often follows. Sumptuary concern, complaints about luxury, and suspicion toward changing standards are not really about clothing or food alone. They are about the permeability of hierarchy. Meat, because it had long been tied to status, became one of the places where this permeability could be felt. Yet the post-plague world was still a medieval world. It remained governed by the church calendar, by local ecological conditions, by the vulnerability of livestock to disease, and by the persistent importance of preservation. Even where meat became somewhat more attainable, it did not become modern. Households still had to salt, smoke, boil, stretch, and plan. The difference might lie not in the disappearance of these habits, but in their relative ease. A pot with more bacon in it, a market visit made with a little more confidence, a pig raised without quite the same terror of total failure. These are not dramatic changes when seen from a distance. But at the level of lived experience, they matter a great deal. And that lived experience may have become more visibly differentiated by occupation. In towns and growing commercial centers, some skilled workers and artisans could access food more steadily than the rural poor had before. Guild life, wage work, and urban market networks created different dietary possibilities from those of heavily burdened smallholders in the old crowded countryside. An urban craftsman's household might not feast like nobility, but it might experience meat as something less exceptional than a peasant cottage had done in harder times. The city, with all its regulation, commerce, and inequality, could nevertheless redistribute food possibilities in ways that altered daily habits. This was especially true where markets grew deeper and more specialized. Butchers, poulterers, fishmongers, and related trades became part of an increasingly articulated food economy. People could buy not only entire animals or major cuts, but smaller quantities, selected parts, preserved goods, and prepared foods. That made access more flexible. It did not make it equal. Yet flexibility itself is historically significant. A household no longer had to rely solely on its own livestock calendar if it had some cash and a functioning market. The town brought animals to the consumer in new forms, and with that came a different relationship to meat as a purchasable thing rather than purely a household-managed event. Still, this was not a clean story of emancipation through markets. Towns were dangerous, prices fluctuated, supply could fail, and the poorest urban dwellers remained acutely vulnerable. Wage labor could improve diets for some and still leave others hungry. Moreover, the very growth of urban demand tied ordinary eaters ever more closely to regional systems of provisioning, transport, and political stability. A town that ate more meat depended more heavily on the countryside, and the countryside remained subject to weather, conflict, and seigneurial power. Improvements could therefore be real and fragile at the same time. Another change worth noticing lies in land use. In some post-plague regions, with fewer people pressing every available acre into grain, pasture could expand. This had obvious implications for sheep and cattle especially. Sheep, of course, are never only about meat in medieval economies. Wool was of enormous importance, sometimes more economically significant than mutton. Yet when pastoral activity expands, so too does the broader animal economy, and with it the potential availability of animal food. Cattle raising, dairying, and the keeping of larger numbers of livestock all affect what ends up in kitchens, even when meat is not the sole or primary goal. This does not mean peasants suddenly became steak eaters. It means the landscape itself, in some places, became more hospitable to livestock than it had been under the pressure of earlier population density. That altered the background conditions of diet. More pasture can mean more dairy, more old animals eventually entering the food chain, more fat, more hides, more manure, more secondary benefits, and, in due time, more meat. These changes are slow and structural, but they are often more important than any single banquet in explaining what people could really eat. At the same time, post-plague Europe did not enjoy long peace or uninterrupted abundance. The later Middle Ages saw war, local devastation, fiscal pressure, and recurrent disease. In France, England, and elsewhere, armies still moved, fields were still damaged, taxes still bit, and regional crises could still destroy the fragile gains of better times. So if some ordinary people ate more meat in one generation or district, that should not be mistaken for a stable continental revolution in comfort. History moved unevenly. A village might recover, prosper modestly, and then be hit by conflict or renewed hardship. A town might enjoy strong provisioning and later struggle. Better access was often conditional, not secure. This unevenness matters because it keeps us from replacing one myth with another. The first myth is that all medieval people lived in smoky deprivation while nobles consumed all the meat. The second myth would be that the Black Death suddenly democratized the table. Neither is true in that simple form. What changed was the balance of possibility. For some people, in some places, the old discipline of scarcity loosened enough that meat moved from rare aspiration toward more regular presence. For others, little improved or improvements were brief. The documentary truth lies in these gradients, not in absolutes. One interesting sign of changing standards is the way authorities and moralists continue to worry about consumption, luxury, and social distinction. These worries suggest that what people ate, wore, and expected from life was shifting enough to be noticed. Food is a sensitive index of such shifts because it sits at the junction of money, custom, bodily pleasure, and social visibility. When laborers begin to consume better food, elites do not always interpret that as simple welfare. They may see it as insolence, disorder, or the weakening of natural difference. Medieval meat, once again, becomes a register of power. The church calendar remained one of the major counterweights to any expansion in meat consumption. Fast days still structured the year. Fish retained its importance, and in some regions the trade in salted or dried fish became extraordinarily important precisely because it allowed societies to maintain religious dietary rhythms at scale. This means that even where meat became more available, it was still embedded in alternation. People did not simply move toward constant flesh consumption. They moved within a disciplined pattern in which meat's place remained socially and spiritually marked. That alternation also preserved meat's specialness. A world of more frequent access could still be a world where feast days mattered, where Lent felt different, where a return to flesh after abstinence carried emotional force. In fact, increased access may have sharpened some frustrations around restriction. The more possible something becomes, the more noticeable its denial can feel. A laborer who could now occasionally afford meat might be more acutely aware of fast days than someone whose ordinary poverty had already narrowed the difference. Historical changes in food often work like that. They make old rules feel newly vivid rather than quietly obsolete. Within noble households, some things changed and some did not. Great feasts remained important. Hunting retained prestige. Venison remained a symbol of privilege. Yet even elite food cultures evolved under new economic conditions, trade patterns, and tastes. Households could buy more, outsource more, account more, and engage with markets in increasingly sophisticated ways. The late medieval great table did not cease to be theatrical, but it inhabited a world where commerce had deepened and where the line between household production and market procurement could be more fluid. Meat still displayed power, but now power often expressed itself through managed access to wider networks. This commercial deepening affected preservation too. Salt remained essential, smoke remained important, and winter still demanded planning. But more developed trade could widen the range of goods available to those with money. Towns saw increasing specialization. Inns, cooks, and food sellers could mediate consumption for travelers, workers, and households alike. The meat economy thus became not only a matter of household prudence, but of increasingly differentiated urban services. A person did not always have to raise, slaughter, and preserve in order to eat. That sounds obvious now, but in medieval terms it was a significant development. Yet, for all that, the texture of meat remained stubbornly pre-modern. Animals were still older than modern meat systems often prefer. Breeding remained oriented toward multiple uses rather than standardized tenderness. Seasonal variation remained sharp. The distance between rich and poor was still palpable in the quality of cuts, the freshness of supply, and the ability to avoid the toughest or saltiest foods. A post-plague improvement in access did not make beef modern beef or pork modern pork. Medieval mouths still encountered gristle, strong flavor, preservation, and variability as normal. This physical continuity is important because it anchors us. It prevents the story from drifting into abstractions about wages and demography alone. However the economy shifted, people still had to cook what they had. A better-paid laborer might buy more meat, but he still took it home to a smoky kitchen, to a pot, to bread, to onions, to ale, to a family table shaped by old habits. A town artisan might purchase cuts from a butcher more often than his grandfather could have imagined, but the meat still belonged to a world without refrigeration, without modern feed systems, without standardized slaughtering on an industrial scale. History changed, but not into us. The emotional meaning of meat may also have deepened in this period because food choices became part of self-understanding. A household that could afford to eat a bit better was not merely consuming more calories. It was experiencing a subtle shift in dignity. Better diet can change how people imagine their own place in the world. It can alter marriage expectations, hospitality patterns, and the care given to the sick. It can make a family feel less exposed to humiliation. This is difficult to measure directly, but it is one of the most human consequences of dietary change. Meat, once a distant sign of other people's privilege, could become a more regular part of one's own domestic life, and that must have mattered. At the same time, better access could increase moral anxiety around indulgence. The old Christian warnings against gluttony did not disappear because more households had more to eat. If anything, abundance in any form tends to generate new preaching about restraint. The feast table continued to invite criticism, the monastery continued to negotiate discipline, and medical writers continued to sort foods according to bodily suitability. Medieval society did not move from scarcity to simple enjoyment. It carried its moral frameworks forward into changing material conditions. There is also another layer to this later medieval shift: the continuing relationship between meat and masculinity, warfare, and social identity. Elite hunting culture remained deeply gendered in many contexts. Martial values still associated substantial food, including meat, with strength and standing. In urban and courtly life, hospitality could still be judged through the quality of the table. Thus, even as some broader access improved, older symbolic meanings persisted. Meat could become more available without becoming ordinary in its cultural charge. It still signaled power, virility, wealth, and proper household governance in many settings. And then there is the poor, who never vanished from the story. Even in regions where average diets improved, there remained landless people, casual laborers, widows, the infirm, migrants, and the chronically precarious. A rising tide, where it occurred, did not lift every bowl equally. Charity continued to matter. Monasteries, parishes, confraternities, hospitals, and households with a reputation for hospitality still played roles in feeding those who could not reliably feed themselves. For these people, the presence or absence of meat in a charitable meal could carry extraordinary significance. A bowl of broth enriched with fat, a bit of flesh on a feast day, or leftovers redistributed from a great household might be remembered not as dietary trend but as relief. This is a useful corrective to broad economic narratives. Structural change matters, but hunger always remains personal. A historian can speak of higher wages or improved land-to-labor ratios, but the body experiences these changes as whether supper feels thin or sufficient. Medieval meat history is strongest when it keeps both scales in view, the scale of demography and the scale of the spoon. By the 15th century in many regions, therefore, we begin to see a food world that is recognizably connected to the earlier Middle Ages but no longer locked in precisely the same way. There is more room in some places, more commercialization, more variation among commoners, and sometimes better access to animal foods beyond the narrowest old patterns. Yet the old architecture remains standing. Class difference, seasonal rhythm, religious fasting, preservation, ecological dependence, and the legal memory of privilege. New possibilities have entered the hall, but the hall itself has not been rebuilt. And that lingering architecture matters especially when we ask what medieval people thought they were eating, not just what they physically consumed. Because food was also meaning. Beef might suggest one kind of solidity, venison another kind of privilege, poultry refinement, pork household practicality. Fish on fast days carried obedience and routine. Broth for the sick carried care. The same ingredients moved through a thick web of interpretation. Late medieval changes altered quantities and access, but they did not empty those interpretations out. If anything, change made them more visible because people could now compare old expectations and new realities more directly. This is where the story begins to lean toward the threshold of the early modern world without yet crossing it. Markets deepen, tastes evolve, states become more ambitious, and regional specializations sharpen. But before any larger transition can fully make sense, we have to look more closely at one last crucial dimension of what eating meat was really like in medieval times. Not just who could get it, preserve it, or display it, but how it sat inside the body, how people believed it affected health, temperament, age, and daily function, and why some forms of meat were feared, prized, prescribed, or avoided for reasons that went far beyond hunger alone. And why some forms of meat were feared, prized, prescribed, or avoided for reasons that went far beyond hunger alone. To end where we ought to end, we have to return from the market, the manor, the monastery, and the plague-shaped countryside to the body itself. Medieval people did not think of meat only as flavor or status. They thought of it as something that acted upon a person. It could strengthen, burden, heat, disturb, comfort, recover, tempt, or corrupt. In learned medicine, in religious discipline, and in everyday experience, meat belonged to a larger conversation about what sort of life the body was meant to live. That is one reason the subject has always been more layered than the old image of endless roasting spits. The medieval world did not simply divide between those who had meat and those who did not. It also divided between those who could choose among meats, those who had to accept whatever form animal food reached them in, and those who measured food not only by appetite, but by season, age, work, sickness, and conscience. A young bird in broth, a salted strip of pork in pottage, a tough piece of old mutton, a ceremonial venison dish in a hall, each entered the body under different meanings. And those meanings mattered because people believed bodies were vulnerable to food in highly specific ways. A rich table, then, did not automatically mean an ideal table. A restrained table did not automatically mean a poor one. A fasting table was not necessarily empty. A peasant's bowl could contain more practical wisdom than a feast menu. Medieval people understood, in their own terms, that eating well was not identical with eating grandly. The body had limits. Digestion had moods. Age altered what seemed suitable. Illness changed what was desirable. Even luxury needed managing. In this sense, the Middle Ages were not simply obsessed with obtaining meat. They were preoccupied with governing it. And perhaps that is the deepest answer to the question of what eating meat was really like in medieval times. It was not, for most people, a stable experience of abundance. It was a changing relationship with power, season, religion, labor, preservation, and the fragile usefulness of animals. Could be celebratory but also repetitive, nourishing but also coarse, desired but also restricted, prestigious but also morally uneasy. For nobles, it could proclaim command. For peasants, it often represented careful household strategy. For monks, it could become a test of discipline. For the sick, a form of care. For the poor, a rare richness in a thin year. For everyone, in one way or another, it belonged to a world where food was never far from work. That is why the fantasy version of medieval meat feels so incomplete. The famous feast was real, but it was only one room in a much larger house. Beyond it were smoke-blackened kitchens, salt barrels, anxious stewards, woodland rites, market ordinances, hungry springs, slaughter days, church fasts, sickbeds, grazing disputes, winter stores, and animals kept alive not because no one wanted to eat them, but because they were more valuable living than dead. The truth is quieter than the stereotype, but also much more human. Medieval people were not endlessly feasting, nor were they simply grimly deprived. Most were balancing appetite against necessity in a world that made every balance visible. And that visibility may be the most striking difference of all. In the modern world, meat often arrives stripped of its past. Medieval meat rarely could. People knew the animal or the season or the preservation method, or the rule that restricted it, or the right that protected it, or the labor that obtained it. They knew, often intimately, what had been spent to make that meal possible. Perhaps that is why meat carried so much meaning. It was never merely a product. It was memory, hierarchy, weather, piety, skill, and risk made edible. So when we picture medieval eating now, it may be better to picture not just the high table, but the whole cycle around it. The pig in the autumn yard, the steward counting stores, the butcher in the market, the monk in refectory on a fast day, the laborer grateful for bacon in the pot, the lady at feast receiving carved game as a sign of rank, the child learning that some animals were wealth, some were work, and some only sometimes became dinner. In that broader picture, the medieval world comes into focus more honestly. Meat was never just a meal. It was one of the clearest ways a society revealed what it valued, what it feared, and how unequally it asked people to live. And maybe that is why the subject still lingers so powerfully. Food is intimate. It bypasses abstraction. When we ask what meat was really like in the Middle Ages, we are really asking what it felt like to inhabit that world in the body. To hunger there, to wait there, to celebrate there, to obey there, to recover there, to work there, and to notice with every bite where one stood in the order of things. If you've stayed with me to the end, I'd be genuinely curious to know what detail surprised you most. or what part of medieval food life feels hardest to imagine living through now. And if this is the kind of calm, deeply human history you enjoy returning to, I'd be glad to have you here for the next journey into the past.